Crust is the brainchild of Garth Ennis, the writer of the famed comic and TV series The Boys. Garth is known for his hard-hitting and brutal content, and Crust doesn't shy away from these values. Crust explores the innate impulses of humanity and how we, as humans, no matter how far we've come, still possess innate desires to turn the world upside down. What if a virus could turn off the switch for morality in our brains? What would happen when everyone in the world had an affinity for pain? What kind of horrors would this wreak on society? How would people survive? How many would survive? These are just some of the questions Garth explores in The Crust, while familiarizing us with the hard-hitting choices one must make in such scenarios. So, without further ado, let's get into the story. Crust Issue 0, The Last Diner. Issue 0 serves as a prequel. It gives us insight into the characters we'll come to know and love as our protagonists. The main protagonist throughout the series is Stan, a 28-year-old man with light brown hair and Caucasian-American ethnicity. Most of the story is told from Stan's perspective, with Garth many times giving us insight into what he's thinking. And Issue 0 is no different. Stan narrates it as a flashback and remembers the first time he and the rest of them encountered someone infected with the C virus. It's a dark and lonely late night outside Jim's diner, a popular place for the locals to catch up on gossip and enjoy Jim Jr.'s rather mundane cooking. The diner is on the corner of a street and is brightly lit with its neon sign always glowing to invite new customers. Stan and the other townspeople are enjoying their meals on the inside, and everyone fails to notice a young man covered in blood approaching the diner menacingly. In his right hand, he holds a bloodied and grotesque part of a human spine, with the pelvic bone still attached to it. This first page gives us a glimpse into how good writing and good artwork can enhance a comic and uplift each story. Jason Burrows, who is the penciler and inker for this issue, masterfully brings Garth's vision to life. The approaching young man is shrouded in shadows, yet you can make out each detail relevant to the story to perfection. You can see the blood of his recent victim dripping from his arms, the bloody footsteps he leaves in his wake. The second page takes us inside the diner, where it's bustling with patrons. Jim is busy cooking his next order, while Cindy serves the customers coffee with a smile on her face. Stan sits alone in the background, quietly enjoying his meal and coffee when the diner door beside him opens up. The blood-covered young man casually. Stan is too busy having his coffee and reading his copy of the shotgun rule to notice anything strange. As he remembers this flashback, Stan recalls how he was strapped for cash back then, but he still loved visiting Jim's diner every Sunday evening where he found familiar faces. He knew these people enough to grunt hello at them, but thankfully not enough to have deep and engaging conversations. And as Stan continues reading and is busy with his thoughts, Cindy notices the blood-covered young man walk in defiantly. She instantly notices that something's wrong about this man. There's something odd about his deranged look, a look that makes the hair on the back of her neck stand instantly. As the man approaches her, he slams the spine down on the counter, spattering blood in every direction while smiling defiantly at her. The two old men who Cindy was serving earlier now look up, clearly revolted by the sight in front of them. Cindy notices something odd about the young man. He has odd rashes emerging on his face that seem to look like a cross. "What is this nonsense?" screams Jim Jr. as he sees the blood-covered young man and the piece of spine he just plopped onto the counter. He then tries to reason with the young man, thinking that this is some kind of prank. Sadly, as it's impeding the appetite of his customers, he asks the man to leave. Stan remembers this encounter vividly. Even when he noticed the blood dripping from the man's arms, the spine's excruciating details, bones, tendons, muscle and flesh still attached to it, Stan ignored the obvious and thought that this was indeed some kind of prank. The first thing he did was to look around for any hidden cameras or someone holding up their phone to record the whole thing. The next panel on this page is another masterfully crafted artwork by Jason Burrows. It shows the young man's face with a black background, giving us a glimpse into his deranged psyche. To him, there is no outside world apart from what he's focused on, his primal desires. His face has been drawn to perfection, showing us every minute detail. His yellowing teeth, slight stubble, deranged and bloodshot eyes, and of course, the rashes slowly spreading across his face, itching to form a cross. As the man continues to smile without uttering a single word, Jim Jr. is growing angrier with each passing second. He even notices the awful smell coming from the young man. It fails to put two and two together. Now, angrier than before, Jim screams at the young man to leave his establishment, but all the stranger does is smile back at him. Cindy, who's been on her toes all this while, knows that something is wrong, very wrong. She desperately tries to hold Jim back, but her boss is having none of it. He again orders the young man to leave his establishment, and that is when all hell breaks loose. Pay close attention to the panels on the next page, as they're the perfect symphony of the infected young man's psyche and the uninfected patrons of the diner. The black background used to showcase the stranger's psyche is now used to showcase chaos. The young man leaps at Jim, holding his head between his blood-covered arms tightly, and then bites off Jim's nose clear off of his face. While doing this, he screams a primal cry, something a human wouldn't do voluntarily. momentarily. Jim, who's too stunned to do anything, can only scream and breathe raggedly as he feels his flesh, his nose being bitten off. All the customers in the diner are horrified, yet too shocked to act or do anything about what's happening. It's only Cindy who has her wits about her, and she uses the glass pot of hot coffee in her hand to smash the stranger right across his face. The scene is horrific. There's now blood everywhere. Blood on the stranger's hand, fresh blood streaming from his face, the blood-covered spine on the counter, and the large stream of blood gushing from Jim's face. The next panel shows us the customers in the diner finally springing into action. They're old and feeble, yet they get to their feet, with Stan now finally managing to emerge from his seat while Cindy attends to Jim. Jim has now slumped to the floor, and with the adrenaline now washing away, he can feel the horrific pain from his wound, the cold air hitting his flesh where once used to be his nose. Cindy tries to hand him a clean cloth to cover his wound and put pressure on it, while simultaneously urging anyone in the diner, to call 911. The officers, unlike their reputation, this time arrive within seconds. The only catch this time, however, is that the police cruiser they arrive in crashes head-on into a nearby building. Again, Jason Burrows masterfully paints the scene with his lighting and artwork. Inside the diner, Stan has run outside, only to see the crashed police cruiser. Despite the pain, Jim has managed to get up and put pressure on his wound, while Cindy continues to console him while waiting for medical assistance. Stan runs outside toward the cops to help them, only to see one of the cops with a rash resembling a cross on his face lying on the bonnet. His neck is clearly broken, and his arms are bent at awkward angles, and yet he sports the same deranged smile Stan saw on the stranger that attacked Jim Jr. in the diner. Inside, Cindy's catching up to the events and putting two and two together. She's turned on the TV to get some information. The broadcast, however, shows a similar picture to what's transpiring outside and inside the diner. The newscaster, who's live, is himself getting attacked by an infected individual as he desperately cries out for help from many of his co-workers. Outside the diner, before Stan could help the surviving police officer, the car blows up. Stan is thrown away, while the other customers who are now outside cover their eyes from the resulting explosion. Cindy is unaffected by the explosion and continues to watch what is transpiring on the TV. Her expression is that of someone cold and calculative, as though she's already forming an exit strategy, a plan to help her survive and escape whatever horrors the future holds for her. Meanwhile, outside, Stan is the one closest to the burning car. Despite the other customers of the diner crying for him to help the officers inside, Stan doesn't dare to move a muscle, for he is the only one who can see what's happening inside. The infected prisoner, who once was stuck in the back seat behind bars, has now managed to get past it and is attacking the uninfected officer while they both get burned by the flames. The rash on his face is now more prevalent than ever and forms a grotesque cross as he strangles and twists the other officer's neck. Inside the diner, the news channel has managed to switch to commercials to avoid showing any more of the horrific attack on the newscaster. And Cindy has finally turned away. Her expression tells us that she's already formed a plan and is now more wary than ever of everyone surrounding her. On the outside, Stan is approached by Thomas and Kelly, two more regular patrons of Jim's diner that he knows by face. Thomas tries to help him up, but Stan can only mutter about what he saw in the burning police car incessantly. The last panel shows us a POV of the burning officer inside the police car as the infected officer strangles him. His hand is now burned to a crisp as he now accepts his fate and watches Stan, Thomas, and Kelly outside the window. This is another great panel showing us the prowess of Jason Burrows and his mastery over the craft of storytelling through artwork. Kelly then tries to draw Thomas and Stan's attention to something, but before they can respond in time, she screams "shit" and holds her head between her hands. When Stan and Thomas turn toward what Kelly was trying to show them, it's already too late. A Boeing 747 is about to crash into the ground and has just clipped the top of the community center, breaking the clock tower clean off of the building. The loud roar of the approaching engines forces everyone to cover their ears and cower in fear as they watch the aircraft fly over their heads. Only Stan hasn't covered his ears, as he's too eager to watch what's transpiring above him. Inside the cockpit, the infected are busy murdering and carrying out horrific acts against those that aren't infected yet. One of the infected flight attendants has shoved his hand down the pilot's throat, drawing a gushing stream of blood, while a female flight attendant scratches and claws at the face of another. The other pilot is infected and has the same deranged look as the other infected individuals, as he deliberately carries out his plan to crash the plane and cause maximum carnage. Stan remembers as he recalls how naive he was, how naive were the survivors, for there was so much they didn't know, and how could they know? How could they believe that what they were watching unfold before their eyes was real? Stan remembers how stupid it was of him not to cover his ears, because at that moment he felt that he'd almost gone deaf, and by the time he covered his ears, the noise was too loud to drown it out of his head. As Thomas and Stan recovered from the shock, it was again Kelly who was the first one to notice what was happening to Jim Jr., because having his nose bitten off by the infected stranger had infected Jim, and the infection was now taking control. This was apparent because of what Kelly was seeing. She sees Jim Jr. stab one of his longtime patrons directly in the back with a huge steak knife. The old man screams in horror and falls to the ground as Jim, without a regard for the man and those around him, continues to twist the knife in the man's back. Stan, who desperately wanted to spring to his feet and run away, couldn't muster up the courage or the will to do so. His legs had turned to jelly because too much was happening too fast for him. Thomas and Kelly are slowly backing away as they watch Jim Jr., the once jovial diner owner, now murder the old man in cold blood in the middle of the street. But what happened next shook Stan, Thomas, and Kelly to the core. What was happening to Jim? What was this infection? And what was it doing to the infected? Because the next second they saw Jim violate the old man in the wide wound he'd created by twisting the steak knife in his back. This was all so wrong. So wrong, yet it was what was happening, and that too, right in front of them. Following what's been happening, the next second brings an even bigger surprise. Because the very next second, the entire city is shrouded in a bright white light. It's a nuclear explosion. Thankfully, Stan was facing in the wrong direction when it happened, but things weren't that lucky for Kelly. Because, along with other residents of the city, the explosion burned Kelly's retinas as well. She screams in pain and horror as her eyes burn. Back then, Stan remembers. He thought the explosion was caused by terrorists or Russia, either of them trying to take advantage of the ensuing mayhem. But he later learned that the explosion was likely caused by one of the infected. Their affinity for mayhem might have forced one of them to pull out the control rods of the nuclear reactor. A bomb didn't cause this explosion. It was caused by a failing nuclear reactor, the one in Wolf Creek. Kelly continues to scream as Thomas and Stan realize that she's been hurt. There's something clearly wrong with her eyes. Stan tries to approach Kelly, but she continues to shoo away anyone who tries to approach her. Stan desperately tries to reason with her, tries to tell her that he's Stan from the diner, the guy she's seen hundreds of times on every Sunday for the past year. But Kelly isn't having any of it. She continues to scream and shoo him away while covering her eyes. It's then that something catches Thomas's eye, for despite Kelly's aching screams, he turns away and focuses his attention on something else. And as Stan joins him to see what has Thomas's attention, Stan's eyes widen too. They widen in horror. But right now, as Stan recalled the entire incident, what shook him and Thomas to the core was the growing mushroom cloud in the distance. The mushroom cloud caused by the nuclear explosion that blinded Kelly moments ago, and its aftermath was now visible in all its glory for everyone to see. Crossed issue number 1, Too Much Salt. It's been a few months. People now survive the apocalypse in groups, and one of these groups has Stan and Cindy as their members. Cindy and Stan stake out a town from a hill. Both of them use binoculars to scout the area with hunting rifles beside them. They see the remnants of the chaos that the Crust inflicted upon the city. Stan and Cindy have been keeping an eye on the town for a few hours now, and thankfully, they haven't spotted any Crust humans yet. All they see are birds, but even they can be a danger because none of them knows how the C virus spreads. Cindy continues scouting and spots a supermarket and 2 grocery stores. They've been broken into, yet they don't seem like they've been emptied. If only they could get a few supplies and maybe some food could set them up for weeks. But as Cindy and Stan rejoice in the hope of some supplies, their joy is cut short when Stan spots a group of Crust in the town square. "God damn it," says Cindy as she turns her gaze toward the town square. Stan, meanwhile, has seen enough violence and mania since all this started back at the diner. He stops looking through the binoculars. He's seen enough depravity at the hands of the infected, the Crust, to have any more of it. He puts his hand on his forehead as Cindy watches the horror unfolding in the town square. The infected are wreaking havoc on the remaining survivors of the town. One of them has been hanged by the throat to a power line passing above them. Another is being stabbed and hacked brutally using anything the Crust could find. One of them uses a machete, while the other uses a restaurant fork to hack at the survivor's flesh. An infected woman and man drag a surviving woman by her hair toward another infected man who's eagerly waiting for her. She's been stripped off of her clothes inhumanely, and Cindy knows the fate that awaits this woman. The infected always keep women survivors alive the longest, and she knows very well why that is. This was the case even before the world became infected with the C virus. It was the fate that awaited every woman in a war-torn country. Whether it was their country's army or the opposing army, their fate was always sealed. This is when we get a glimpse into Cindy's personal life. She's a single mother, and her son Patrick is not more than 10 yards away from her. She doesn't trust anyone with him, none of the survivors in their group, not even Stan. Stan has often wondered why it is this way, and on the face, Cindy had been blunt with the group and Stan. She didn't trust either of them to take care of Patrick. She said she knew that none of them were competent enough, and this was the truth. Stan knew none of them were as capable as Cindy in these times, and so while Cindy and Stan were staking out the town, Patrick was a mere yard away playing with his toys, and once Cindy had spotted the infected, Stan knew it was time to leave. The two of them gathered their gear and clambered up to leave the stakeout spot with Patrick right beside Cindy. As they walk through the dense forest for an hour or so, we finally see the hiding place of the survivors. It's a now abandoned train tunnel with Thomas sitting outside of it, keeping a close eye on the surroundings. By now, Patrick has grown tired of walking, which is why he's now clinging onto his mother's shoulders. Stan greets Thomas as Cindy and him enter the tunnel, and Thomas is more than happy to see their friendly faces. He gives a cheerful hello to them all, and Patrick obliges him with a hello of his own. He then goes on to ask Stan if they had any luck finding some supply for the group, but Stan's droopy face gives away his answer even before he can utter a single word. 20 miles for nothing. Let me get some food, Thomas, and I'll take a turn out here. Stan's words are like a Mozart symphony to Thomas. Although he's happy to be the lookout, God knows that it drains the life out of him. And Stan offering to take over after he's done with his meal is nothing short of a God-sent wish. Inside, we see the group of survivors. A small, scrawny group of everyday people trying to survive in this apocalyptic and unholy land that they all once used to call home. Stan's eating his can of food as he addresses us, the readers, and breaks the fourth wall. He tells us that though the infected seem smart, seem to understand language and retain their motor skills, they can't be reasoned with. But in the past few months, it seems he's seen everything. He's seen someone try to reason with the crust, trade with them, offer them food and more in exchange for their life, and yet the crust simply refuse. It was as though chaos, pain, and depravity is what they lived for. Stan at first too did his best to have some sort of order, some sort of routine, a way for him to keep his head about him. He tried to bathe every day, tried to brush every day. His teeth had always been a priority for him, and yet, once he was forced to take a shit in the wild, everything, any sense of routine he tried to hold onto went straight out the window. Stan goes on to tell us that the first to get killed were the Mad Max fans, people that had prepared for the apocalypse, hoarded food and weapons in order to survive, because these people were the first to fire, the first to start gunfights. And that's when they found out what a grave mistake it was, because any sound of a fight drew in the infected like moths to a flame. And no matter how many bullets you peppered them with, how many times you shot them, there was always another infected coming your way. Stan never felt sorry about them, sorry about watching them die. Because once they were dead and the infected had moved on, he could loot these people for valuable supplies that could help him survive. Ammo, canned food, clean clothes. Everything these people had hoarded for years was now his for the taking. He continues gulping down his share of cold, canned food as he tells us, the readers, that it's been 10 months since that night at the diner. The night where they saw everything unfold right before their eyes, and then watched a nuclear explosion go off in the distance. The explosion had rendered Kelly blind, and in the past few months they'd gained a few members in their group, but lost even more. Everyone's faces were droopy. Every eye you spotted was full of sadness. The air itself seemed to have been heavy with the stench of depression. No matter how far you ran, no matter how many air fresheners you used, no matter what anyone did, this stench of depression followed each survivor. This is when Stan hears Joel speak up. Joel is a man in his late 30s and has a wife, Amy, and a daughter, Arwen. A first look at Joel is enough to tell the entire room that he isn't an adept survivor, especially with the apocalypse they're constantly facing. Yet, despite his shortcomings, Joel comes off as quite an opinionated, mean guy. Stan has often wondered why Joel is like this, and when he learned that Joel has been into fantasy games and stories all his life, it all pieced together for Stan. Like the stories and games he played, Joel was looking for a simple and single solution to end his misery. This is why he was always grasping at straws, always holding opinions that weren't backed up by facts or evidence. And this current rant was just the same. He was going on and on about salt. Salt. Of all the things Joel could be deluded about right now, it was salt that he chose. Joel is telling a story about his recent encounter with the infected, how he was in a supposedly abandoned supermarket store when he was jumped by a cross. The infected man came lunging at Joel and he ran for his life. When running, Joel came across a huge pile of salt on the floor, and despite his size, Joel managed to jump over it. The infected man, however, wasn't so lucky. He fell straight into the pile of salt. This left the infected man screaming in pain while coughing his lungs out. This encounter alone makes Joel believe that salt is the weakness that all of them have been searching for. How salt is the kryptonite of the crust and can help them turn the tide against them. He then takes out a 10-pound bag of salt from his bag and brandishes it to everyone in the group like a weapon. Despite his enthusiasm, despite the joy in his voice, none of the members of the group are uplifted by Joel's proclamation. Kelly's the one who tries to reason with him, asks him to look at the facts and realize this is just his wishful thinking taking over again. But Joel, when Joel is in one of his rants and deluding himself, nothing can stop him. He attacks Kelly by telling her that she knows nothing. She wasn't there to witness what he witnessed, which is why she doesn't realize that salt is the kryptonite to everyone who is crossed on Earth. Stan, who's finished his meal by now, calls Joel classy, sarcastically, in an attempt to point out Joel's bias to him. Kelly then chimes in with a quip of her own. She tells Joel that anyone, be it human or crust, would get uncomfortable and cough their lungs out if they got a face full of salt. She then asks Joel if he saw the cross die due to salt, and this is what pushes Joel over the edge. "I was too busy running, Kelly, okay? I grabbed one of the sacks and I ran like hell, but I heard it screaming." And this is when Joel's story begins to fall apart. "Look, this is real. This isn't some delusion. We've been looking for a way to stop running, to fight back against these things." And that's when Stan and Kelly latch onto Joel's words. Have they been looking for a way to stop running, fight back? Do they really want to fight back? No? They haven't been looking for a way. And no, they don't want to fight back. Everyone in the group agrees, and everyone wonders where Joel is getting this idea. Stan has had enough. He finishes drinking his water and irks Joel on even more. "You know what this is? This is your sci-fi shows. Your movies and your Dungeons and Dragon games you used to play." And despite Stan's harsh words and shot at Joel, the latter is clearly missing the point. He tells Joel that this scenario, their reality, isn't some story Joel has dreamed of or played through before. This is real. The Crossed are real. Them taking over the entire world is real. Them raping, killing, and cannibalizing anyone they can get their hands on is real. This isn't some story where Joel can magically find a way to get back at the Crust. They don't have a single weakness, and Joel needs to come to terms with that. Joel shuts up, but he looks at Stan with disdain, as though cursing and abusing him in his mind. He sneers at Stan, who now shuts up. Stan knows he isn't perfect because this sneer, this look on Joel's face, is what he's come to crave in these past few weeks. He likes to make Joel sneer. He likes making Joel look stupid in front of his wife and daughter. He simply can't stand the man, because if it wasn't for the group's members like Stan and Cindy, Joel and his family would never have stood a chance to survive in this harsh reality they currently call home. Stan was frustrated, and he clearly took it out on Joel. The two of them get into a heated argument, which is only stopped when Kelly chimes in. "Are you willing to gamble your family's life? Because that's what you're going to be doing, Joel." Before Joel can come up with something smart to say, he's interrupted by his wife, Amy, who diverts his attention to more pressing matters at hand, namely his daughter, Arwen. Arwen has been growing thinner and thinner each passing day, and Amy has been more than concerned. Despite his recent salt discovery, he was supposed to get some decent food while in that supermarket, but all he managed to get was this 10-pound bag of salt. She tells him that Arwen needs good food and some proper rest to recover, else she might become a victim of malnutrition. Joel realizes his mistake and puts his hand on his daughter's head as he apologizes to his wife. "I know, honey, I know, but if there's no fighting back, if there's no way around this, then what is there?" And hearing this, Cindy chimes in for the first time. She's been busy feeding Patrick and putting him to bed while listening to this entire conversation, but this last statement from Joel forces her to join the conversation. She tells Joel that the only thing left to do is to survive, to stay alive for their children and for each other. That's the only thing they should focus on. Stan has had enough. He knows Cindy is right, and her last word is enough to end this conversation for good. He puts his rifle on his back, picks himself up and slowly begins to walk out of the tunnel to relieve Thomas of his lookout duty and take his place instead. Thomas has been hearing snippets of the heated conversation going on inside, and when he asks Stan about it, Stan simply shrugs it off. He asks Thomas to go inside and get some rest while he takes over the lookout duty. As Stan takes over the lookout duty, silence takes over and his thoughts start to echo in his mind. He remembers the day of the diner. How that once the explosion had gone off, Kelly had lost her sight and likely become blind. How she was screaming and hoping that this was temporary, while Thomas desperately tried to console her. Stan remembers how he'd been leading the two of them out of the city when he was suddenly ambushed by a crossed woman. Stan had screamed in horror when he was jumped by the woman, and this scream had thrown Kelly into a fit of panic. The crossed woman tore the fence and lunged at Stan while screaming for someone named Joey, someone that likely turned her. The crossed woman was in a fit of rage and lunacy as she proclaimed to carry out the same horrific acts that she'd been forced to live through by Joey. She had a large steak knife sticking out of her back, and yet it seemed to make little to no difference when it came to her lunacy and rage. And as she clambered for Stan, she failed to notice Thomas and Kelly right beside her. Thomas was looking on in horror as he backed away, while Kelly was simply screaming for God, feeling helpless because of her blindness. The crossed woman then noticed Thomas and Kelly beside her and proclaimed to put even them through horrific and inhumane acts which involved rape and cannibalism. She then grabs the knife in her back and thanks Joey for it. Joey likely stabbed her, and now she was going to use it to stab the three of them. The woman pulls out the knife so it doesn't even hurt her, but before she can proceed with her plans, a huge pickup truck crashes through the fence and crushes the woman under its front tires. This is how Stan, Thomas, and Kelly met Cindy. She was in the driving seat, and she only said one thing to them: "Get in if you're coming. Make it fast." Thomas is the first one to spring to his feet and take his chances. He knows Cindy. He's seen her defend herself at the diner. So, without a second thought, he helps Kelly get in the back of the pickup truck and follows her promptly. Kelly tries to protest, tries to make sense of what's happening, but Thomas is quick to reassure her that everything's okay, that he'll explain everything once they're safe and away from the city. Stan, however, just like the time at the diner, is too shocked to even move. Like the time at the diner, he's down on the ground, backing away as he watches the half-dead and half-alive corpse of the crossed woman slowly come back to life. Cindy screams at him to get up or get out of the way, and it's then that he gets up and opens the passenger door to the truck. This was the first time he laid his eyes on Cindy's son, Patrick. Patrick was snuggled close to his mother with a cozy beanie on the top of his head. Stan gets in the car and greets Patrick, who greets him back promptly. Cindy orders him to put on his seatbelt quickly, a reflection of the good values she wanted to bestow upon her son, no matter what was happening around them. No matter if there was a crossed woman crushed under her truck or not. As Stan gets in the truck, he feels the confidence oozing from Cindy, and without a second thought, he asks her what's going on. Cindy doesn't know much herself, but she's been keeping tabs on the radio and TV, and things don't look good. Cindy knows it's some sort of virus, and it seems to be spreading rapidly. Cindy knows that running away and leaving the city was their best chance, and that's when she spotted the three of them, Stan, Thomas, and Kelly. They were the only three people headed in the right direction, headed outside the city. Stan then looks over at Cindy again, and then recoils in horror. Cindy's right ear is mangled, and looks like it's been infected. And if that's the case, Patrick, him, Thomas and Kelly could be in serious danger. But Cindy calms him down and, without taking her eyes off of the road, tells Stan that her ear is burned. It was burned by her abusive husband when he held her head close to the burning stovetop a few years ago. Stan apologizes, but Cindy brushes him off. Stan might be sorry, but he isn't as sorry as her husband was after she was done with him for having burned her ear off. She then asks Patrick to close his eyes and go to sleep. The road is becoming riddled with the crust, and she can't have her son watching all the horror unfolding before them. Back in the present, Kittrick, another one of the group's members, had relieved Stan of his lookout duty a few hours ago. Stan had been fast asleep and was dreaming about the past when he was suddenly woken up by Cindy. Kittrick had spotted a group of crossed down the hill. She asks Stan to wake the rest of them up while she gets Patrick ready. She wants everyone up and mobile within the next few minutes, and by the looks of it, nobody's going to question her. The group soon packs up, leaves the tunnel, and starts walking up the hill. Things seem to be going smoothly when Stan looks down the hill and spots around 20 plus crossed humans making their way toward them. Cindy orders everyone to run for it, and they all start climbing the hill hastily. As everyone struggles to climb the hill, suddenly there's a loud crack and the sound of bones breaking. It's Amy, Joel's wife, and she's broken her ankle. She holds her daughter Arwen close to her as Joel rushes down the hill to try and save them. He urges Amy to get up and get going, but Amy alone can't walk on a broken ankle. She knows she has to make a tough choice, which is why she asks Joel to escape with their daughter Arwen. But before he leaves, she wants him to shoot and kill her. Joel starts to visibly panic as he realizes the tough choice he faces now. He starts to sweat profusely, and soon tears start streaming down his face. He can't kill his wife and escape with his daughter, but Amy can't and won't stop screaming for her husband to follow through. "Joel, there's no other way. You have to do this. Joel." "No, you listen to me, Amy. Listen to me. It'll be fine. Everything will be fine." The two of them continue to argue while the group of crossed is getting closer and closer to the three of them. Cindy and the rest of the group have climbed the hill as they watch the events unfold below. Amy is now on the ground crying frantically and asking her husband to just escape with Arwen, but Joel has different plans. Joel has created a circle of salt around them and is standing over his family triumphantly. Amy knows this is a stupid plan, and she can't help but scream at her husband to make the right choice. The group of the crossed humans approaches them, and at first they seem to take notice of the salt circle. Many of them sneer at it, and for a moment, it seems Joel's theory might actually be right. The next second, however, one of the crossed brushes the salt aside and enters the circle, and then all hell breaks loose. Most of them first start by killing and dismembering Arwen. They then play a game of tag with her body parts as the rest of them continue hacking away at what's left of her body. The ones that aimed for Amy and Joel are now raping them and hacking away at their body simultaneously. Amy, with a significant chunk of her skull now missing, is screaming at Joel in sheer anger, and although she hasn't turned yet, her anger would make anyone believe that she's become one of the crust. She screams at Joel, calls him names, abuses him because of the fate he chose for his family. She screams at her husband to look at what's happening to them, all the while she's getting raped. Joel, too, suffers a similar fate. However, he can't help but look around at his tormentors with a dumbfounded expression as they disembowel and play with his guts while raping him. Upon the hill, Stan can hear the entire commotion, the screams, the cries of help, Amy's angry voice, and yet he doesn't dare walk back. He slowly lifts his binoculars to maybe see if by some miracle Joel and his family survived, but Cindy stops him instantly. Stan himself knows it's all over, and what might be transpiring now is something he doesn't need to see. Frost, issue number 2, The Plan. It's been a week or so since the group lost Joel and his family. They lost a few more along the way, but have gained more members as well. They're now holed up alongside their new members in an abandoned house. Their newest member is Randall, another seasoned survivalist in his late 30s. Stan is talking to Randall about the havoc wreaked by the crust across the country. Randall has managed to keep tabs on most cities and tells Stan that the crust have flooded most of New York City while having burned down most of Texas. He goes on to tell Stan that the subway in New York needs to be pumped out 24/7, which is why the city is currently flooded. Randall met a guy fleeing New York who told him that Manhattan's avenues have now turned into rivers. Stan then goes on to ask about Texas, and something hits home. Randall looks down into his can of food and sighs. He's from Texas, and he saw what happened to it firsthand. Failsafes on refineries were overloaded, and this left most of the state a burning mess. Thomas is busy fiddling with the generator, while Cindy and Kelly are talking to Stan and Randall as they discuss what's happening around the country. It's then that Kittrick walks, and we realize that he was responsible for tonight's stakeout, while Jeff keeps a steady watch for them on the outside. Kittrick tells Cindy that he couldn't spot a crossed person for miles around them, and although they're using a generator, anyone would need to get at least 50 yards or closer to even hear its sound. They're safe for now, and that's what matters. Cindy promises to relieve Jeff from the guard duty in a couple of minutes as she goes back to her conversation with Randall. Kittrick, as always, has his head hung low. His eyes are full of sorrow. It's as though the man has lost his will to live. Cindy, meanwhile, is asking Randall about his travels. If he's managed to survive this long and has been heading north of Texas all this while, he's bound to have come across more groups like them. Randall goes on to tell her that he did indeed meet a couple of groups here and there, but none of them were headed the correct way, according to him, which is why he abandoned all of them. The next panel shows us the tiny generator the group has fired up, and attached to it are dozens of electrical devices, all hungrily charging up for the travels that await them. Dozens of mobile phones, walkie-talkies, all have been plugged in, because running electricity is a very luxurious and rare commodity these days. Randall then gets up and is about to turn in for the night when Kelly stops him and asks the most important question. Where is Randall headed? Which is the correct direction to choose? Surely it's not this place. And Kelly's right. This is indeed Randall's resting stop for today and tomorrow. Randall tells Kelly that he's headed northwest, and he wants to head northwest as far as possible while avoiding Canada. Once he's done that, he plans to head further north until he reaches Alaska. So the plan is to reach Alaska, because the harsh climate and the limited population likely means that there are less crust there. Stan then goes on to ask Randall why he wants to avoid Canada. A grim look suddenly crosses across Randall's face. He sighs and tells Stan that when the outbreak first started, the Canadian government used all of its military might to seal off the borders. The idea was that this was an epidemic only affecting the Americans. Sadly, by the time the Canadian government realized its mistake, it was already too late. Randall shudders and says that the thought of any of the crust wielding and using military equipment, tanks, sends chills down his spine. Cindy sighs as she caresses Patrick, who's fast asleep beside her. So, going to Canada is now out of the question. It's the reason he plans to head west first and maybe make his way to the north via the sea. Stan then goes on to ask Randall that if he really believes the crust can operate tanks. Randall tells him that he knows for sure. He's seen people turn right before his eyes, people he once knew, and when they turned, they retained their skills. Be it butchering, driving, or operating machinery, the crust retain their skills. This is why there's no doubt in his mind that the crust are likely operating tanks and other military equipment with ease. Stan agrees, but if that was the case, why didn't they ever spot any of them flying any airplanes? And that's when Kelly reminds him of the night at the diner when they saw a crust deliberately crash a Boeing 747 into the ground just for the fun of it. She then wonders that no matter the case, does anyone know if the crust can pass on their skills? Maybe train others to fly planes or drive tanks? This is what catches everyone's attention. Randall straightens up and starts to wonder. Stan snaps out of his daze and looks towards Cindy for an opinion or some sort of answer. But Cindy couldn't care less. It's the same old question that they've wondered a million times in the past. What do the crust do in their free time? What do they do when they aren't doing them? Randall then chimes in, saying that he saw something a few days ago that might finally answer this question. A flashback now begins, and we see things from Randall's point of view. He was traveling through the country and was trying to cross the I-81 highway when he saw a group of crust pull someone over and get to work on them. Randall thought of it as a regular occurrence at first, but when he looked closer, he realized that the person being assaulted by the crust wasn't screaming for help. He was screaming out of joy. He was laughing. The next page is dedicated to a single panel and shows us the horrific acts the crust are capable of in all its glory. The person being assaulted is on the ground and laughing to his heart's content. He's been disemboweled, and one of the crust is using his intestines to satiate his hunger. Another is busy tearing his limbs apart, and a torn piece of one of his legs, it's being used by another crust to pleasure himself. The scene is nothing short of a nightmare, yet Randall can't forget the maniacal laugh of the crust that was being assaulted. Stan shudders He's never seen or even heard from someone of the crust hunting their own kind before. Randall then goes on to speculate that it's the evil in the crust. It's got to make its way out somehow, and when they can't find the uninfected, they turn on their own kind. And this is another debatable topic Cindy has heard in the past. Whether it's the biblical evil, inane madness, or the morality switch turned off in the crust, it doesn't really matter anymore. All that matters is survival. Randall and Stan continue speculating as Cindy gears up to go outside and take over the lookout duty from Jeff. She straps her rifle to her back and heads out. As she goes outside, Randall decides to join her, and something clicks inside Stan. Suddenly, he's afraid that something might spark between Cindy and Randall, and Stan might just lose his shot with her. He sighs and joins Thomas for a game of chess. Thomas goes on to ask Stan if it bothers him if Randall joining Cindy for the lookout bothers him, because they both are quite similar. They're both survivalists, don't take crap from anyone, and both use minimal words whenever possible. Stan denies having feelings for Cindy, and a battle of expletives ensues between the two. It's their way of keeping their spirits high, but no matter how much gusto they use to friendly abuse the other, expletives too seem to have lost their luster. Stan is overdoing it, and Thomas has to call him out on the same. It's not that expletives have lost luster, it's Stan who's got the blues. Because he's not only losing the game, he's also letting his blues control his anger. But before Thomas can say more, we hear Jeff rush into the basement behind Cindy while apologizing to her, desperately. Jeff is a man in his late 40s, but Cindy has no time to cater to him. She barges in and orders everyone to get up and be ready to leave in the next 2 minutes. Cindy bends down and helps Patrick put on his shoes, while Kelly searches for Thomas. Kelly and Thomas have grown quite close over the past few months, especially since Kelly went blind. She's been relying on Thomas for survival all this while, and Thomas hasn't failed her. At least, not yet. Stan rushes around, packing his things as he asks Cindy what happened. She goes on to tell everyone that Jeff buried the bodies of the previous owners of the house, and the ruckus it created has likely attracted a group of the crust. Jeff frantically tries to apologize. The man just felt wrong leaving their bodies in the driveway. Stan can't believe Jeff. He always pulls stunts like this and puts the group in danger. In a fit of rage, he hurls abuses at Jeff and is promptly stopped by Cindy to correct his language. She won't tolerate such words, especially around her son Patrick. Stan apologizes, and by now, everyone has packed their bags and is headed out of the basement. When they reach upstairs, Randall is already looking out for any signs of the crust nearing the building. He looks out a broken window that's been boarded up and tells everyone that he heard the hum of an engine a while back. It's best that they leave this place right now. Cindy orders everyone to leave out the back of the house and then climb the hill to the top. As they climb the hill, Jeff again tries to apologize to Cindy as she carries Patrick in one arm while holding a rifle in the other. Jeff tells her that he simply didn't think that the crust would notice, and then Cindy tells him that this is the exact reason they've lost so many members of the group in the past few weeks, because none of them thought. None of them used their brains. She orders everyone to keep moving when suddenly a bullet comes whizzing through the air and catches Randall directly in his right shoulder. This causes him to drop his shotgun and wince in pain, but there's no turning back now. The crust have caught up to them, and they need to climb the hill hastily. The crust haven't stopped shooting, and so Randall has to leave his shotgun behind. Cindy orders everyone to head for the valley on the other side of the hill and then enter the woods. They can lose the crust there. She has an escape route already planned. Cindy always plans 2 steps ahead, and Cindy's plan works. By nightfall, they've all managed to lose their pursuers and have set up tents to pass the night. It's raining heavily, and despite the heavy downpour, Jeff sits on a broken log, alone and soaking, continuing his lookout duty. Cindy and Stan accompany Scott in a tent as he tries to patch up Randall. Scott is their resident doctor. He used to be a paramedic before the apocalypse. He tells Randall that he's in mild shock, which is why his body is unable to regulate its temperature. He treats Randall's wound, which is thankfully nothing serious. It was a clean shot, and the bullet went straight through. There's only minor tissue damage. No veins or arteries were punctured, and there's no sign of an infection. Randall was super lucky to have survived this encounter. Randall continues groaning and wincing as Scott patches him up. Cindy then sighs as she watches Jeff outside getting soaked from head to toe in the heavy rain. She asks Stan to go relieve Jeff, because if he gets sick from the rain, he's as good as dead. Stan puts on his raincoat and relieves Jeff of his lookout duty, and as he takes over and sits alone in the rain, the constant rhythm of the raindrops hitting his raincoat takes him back to the day Cindy had picked him, Thomas, and Kelly up. And this begins another flashback. Cindy, Patrick, Thomas, and Stan are parked outside a shopping complex, likely staking the place out before heading in for the supplies. Thomas is worried about Kelly, who's busy catching a much-needed nap in the back of the pickup truck. Her eyes have been crudely covered using a makeshift bandage, and Thomas is asking Cindy if she thinks that this blindness is permanent. She asks Thomas if Kelly was directly looking at the explosion when it happened, and Thomas nods in agreement. A grim look falls over Cindy's face, and she tells Thomas that it's highly likely that the blindness is permanent if that happens to be the case. Thomas, however, still holds on to hope, as it's only been 48 hours since the explosion. Maybe Kelly's eyes just need more time and rest to recover. Cindy agrees, because she isn't a doctor and she can't be sure about this. Stan, who's been sitting on the ground with his back against the truck, now chimes in, saying that he was hoping Cindy would know more about this thing, because she seems to know a lot. He then asks her if she was in the military, and Cindy shakes her head in denial. She's now inside the pickup truck, handing cut-up apple slices to Patrick. She then steps out of the pickup truck and holsters a pistol in her pants, as Stan carefully asks the next few questions. He first inquires about Cindy's husband, and she tells him that he's no longer in the picture. He then asks her where she got so many guns, and she tells him about her grandfather, how it was her grandfather who taught her how to use guns, how to take care of them, and how to repair them. She then quickly changes the subject before Stan can ask any more questions. She tells them that she no longer wishes to use the truck for traveling, even when it's dark outside. Thomas asks her what made her change her mind, and she tells them that there's 2 reasons for this decision. Firstly, she hasn't heard any vehicle since morning, which means any moving vehicle or sound of an engine could be a calling card for the crust. Secondly, the radio too has now gone completely silent. Not even the federal broadcast warning about the outbreak are playing anymore. This means that the crust have likely taken hold over the entire country. Risking the use of the pickup truck will paint a giant target on their backs. Stan then goes on to speculate that if what Cindy is saying is right, then this is like a movie, where anyone that gets bitten turns into the crust, like zombies. Thomas then interjects and says it might be like that, but the crust they've encountered sure as hell don't look dead at all. And this is the first time when Cindy had corrected Thomas and Stan for their language around Patrick. At first, Stan had tried to protest. Why the hell did language matter now, when the entire world was going up in flames? There wasn't a school for Patrick to go to, no university to attend. Hell, there was no society to pretend to be an upstanding citizen. But despite his protests, language was non-negotiable for Cindy. And this shut Stan up. He's about to ask Cindy about their plan next, when Thomas suddenly looks up toward the sky and cries, "Jesus!" And when they look up, they can't believe what they're seeing. Hundreds and hundreds of human bodies are hurtling through the sky and falling to the ground. Bodies are hitting the asphalt, the pavement, buildings, anything. Any solid structure for hundreds of yards is being splattered by human bodies. Each body makes a loud crunch as it hits a solid structure and then explodes into 1,000 pieces of flesh and bone. Cindy looks up and sees a plane passing by high in the air and puts 2 and 2 together. She then asks Stan and Thomas to pack up and get back under cover. Despite what they've just witnessed, Cindy seems awfully calm, and this makes Stan question her. How can she be so calm? Keep her head about her while everyone loses theirs. Cindy tells him that he'd have led her life. He'd be like her too. When life continues throwing troubles and obstacles your way at each step, you often get used to it and start expecting an issue or an obstacle around every corner. Stan has now snapped out of his flashback and is checking in on Randall back at their makeshift camp. Scott's been keeping an eye on Randall and tells Stan that there's still no sign of infection. He's been cleaning the wound regularly and has been taking as much care as he can with their current supplies. Sadly, Scott fears that Randall might be in a coma from the sheer shock and the blood loss of it all. He hasn't woken up since he went to sleep. Stan tells Scott that they can wait because they can't move ahead unless they know where the crust are. This is why he and Cindy are headed out to scout for them. Scott then leaves the tent and offers Patrick a piggyback ride as Cindy and him prepare to leave the camp. He picks Patrick up and places him on his back as Cindy tells him that nobody heard a thing in the night. This means that the crust that were pursuing them either missed them by a long shot or have taken a different route. They decide to start at the abandoned house they were holed up in and then circle their way back to the camp to ensure they don't miss a location. As they walk out of the makeshift camp, Thomas is sitting on a tree stump watching them leave the camp, and when Stan spots this, he apologizes to Cindy for what happened. Cindy, on the other hand, is unaffected and asks Stan why he'd apologize to her about Randall, and this is all the confirmation Stan needed. A sly smile spreads across his face as he watches Thomas notice the same. Without saying a word, Stan holds up a middle finger to him as Stan gives him a nod of agreement. It doesn't take long for Cindy and Stan to find the crust that were hunting them a day ago. They're all holed up in the abandoned house that was their temporary base. Both Cindy and Stan keep an eye on them using their binoculars, while Patrick plays with his toy car behind them. They're high up on a hill from where they can see the house clearly. They've spotted 8 crossed men so far, and they're standing in a circle just outside the property. Cindy is confused, and she can't figure out what the crossed men are doing. But when Stan takes a closer look and sees that everyone is naked and pointing towards the center of the circle, he realizes it's the biscuit game that he once heard about from a sports coach. Cindy is confused, and he goes on to tell her what this rumored game is. Apparently, all big sports guys stand around in a circle and try to, arrive on a single biscuit as fast as possible. The last one to arrive has to eat the biscuit. Cindy is disgusted, but goes back to keeping an eye on the crust men. She tells Stan if what he's saying is true, then sadly there isn't a cookie or biscuit in sight. Cindy is disgusted when she realizes that they're collecting their semen in a bowl. But there's something else in the bowl, something Cindy can't make out, but from his point of view, Stan can see exactly what else is in the bowl. It's bullets. And as soon as he says bullets, Cindy grabs a gun, jumps to her feet, and starts walking swiftly toward the camp. Back at the camp, Scott has entered Randall's tent to clean his wound again. Randall, as expected, is sleeping on his side with his injured shoulder in the air. Scott gently tells him that he's here to clean his wound and will have to roll him onto his back. But when Scott rolls Randall on his back, it's already too late. Randall has become completely infected, and the crossed rash is quite prominent across his face. Before Scott can scream for help, it's already too late. Randall opens his eyes and attacks Scott, and all the campers outside can hear Scott screaming. Kelly is the one nearest to their tent, and Thomas desperately calls for her as she tries to make sense of what's happening in the camp. But before Thomas can rush to her, Randall pokes his blood-covered head out of the tent and is about to head straight for Kelly. He runs toward her, trying to rape her, while Kelly desperately tries to back away and run to safety. The other members of the camp start shooting at Randall, and one of them even manages to hit him in his hip, but Randall isn't slowing down. Kelly runs into the woods, hitting branches and trees along the way as Randall begins to close up on her. He's sporting the same deranged smile seen on every crossed face till now. Thomas is running behind them and is trying to circle around the two of them so that he can reach Kelly first. And when he manages to get in front of her, he desperately screams for her to follow his voice, to run toward him. But by now, Randall has closed in. He's mere inches away from Kelly and is desperately clawing at the air to get his hands on her. The next second, Cindy steps out from behind a tree and shoots Randall directly in the face. Bang! It's all finally over. But sadly, firing off this shot and the others before means that they've alerted the other crossed in the area, and they should escape as fast as possible. We see Stan holding Patrick in his arms and keeping his face away to prevent the kid from seeing any of this violence. The campers gather their things and start walking through the woods as Stan and Cindy discuss how smart the crossed have become. They're now strategizing, finding new ways to turn the uninfected into the crust. Although the bullets are a slower way to turn people, they sure do work, and Randall was a confirmation of that. Stan thinks that the crossed are getting smarter, but Cindy doesn't think so. She knows there are a million kinds of mean, and this was just one of the million ways. She then lowers her gaze, and we finally see some of Cindy's emotions seep through her eyes. She pauses, and then says to Stan, "When we stop tonight, we should talk about Alaska." Stan nods, and then gets lost in his thoughts. He wonders how much he had changed, how much they'd all changed since the apocalypse started. They had to always be on their toes, be ready to kill at a moment's notice. Kill anyone, be it friend or foe, and none of them ever stopped to wonder what this was doing to their souls, what it could turn them into. If ever there'll be any difference between them and the people society would prosecute when that used to be a thing. First, issue number 3, Choices. Things aren't going too well for the group. They were traveling through an abandoned town when they were cornered by a group of Crust. And although they've managed to hide, the Crust are too close for comfort. Cindy, along with Patrick and Stan, hide behind a few destroyed cars as the Crust scan and make their way through the streets as though looking for something or someone. Stan is visibly upset and scared because he's never been this close to the Crust before, at least not moments before things became a lot worse. Cindy slowly puts her fingers to her lip with her cold eyes, and Stan knows he better shut up and get his feelings in control. The next panel zooms out and shows us the wider shot where we can see the rest of the group not far off from Cindy and Stan. They're hiding behind a destroyed and overturned bus with guns ready in hand. Thomas holds Kelly in one arm while brandishing his pistol in the other. Unlike Kittrick, who's focused on listening to each cross near him make their way through the street, Thomas is visibly scared and praying to God that this will be over soon. By now, a Crossed has managed to come awfully close to the car Stan is hiding behind and is a mere foot or two away from him. Stan is visibly scared and is sweating like crazy. He closes his eyes and holds his breath so as not to give away his position, and minutes later, it's all over. Cindy tells Stan that the Crossed are leaving, and it's then that he opens his eyes. She goes on to tell Stan that by the way they were searching and moving through the streets, they're likely hunting someone else, like a survivor that's hiding nearby or was here a few hours ago. They watch the Crossed continue to search the streets for whoever they're hunting as they slowly walk away from the hiding group. They all then slowly regroup and get a bearing of their surroundings. Stan's inner monologue goes on to tell us that whenever they've had an encounter like this in the past, the group usually tends to wait at least 2 hours before moving on. However, this time they all decided it was wise to wait for at least 4 hours. And while they were hiding, around 30 minutes after the group of Crossed had passed them, they'd heard a dozen gunshots which were followed by complete silence. This was quite odd, because when the Crossed found their prey, it was usually followed up by a lot of screaming for hours. And once this had happened, they'd heard an engine start up and then slowly fade off into the distance. This is what made the group add an additional extra 2 hours to their wait time. We now see Thomas, along with 2 more members of a group, enter a destroyed grocery shop to find some supplies. Sadly, the entire store has been picked clean off by any remaining survivors that might have passed through the town. The unknown member of the group who hasn't been named in this issue is a young man with blonde hair in his late 30s. He begins to move out into the street after spotting a can of food just lying there. Jeff knows this is a bad idea and begs for the young man to stay in cover and out of the streets. But before the young man can heed to Jeff's advice, it's already too late. He's bent down and is picking up the can of baked beans when suddenly his right foot gets caught in a bear trap. He screams out in pain, but the very next second, a sharp arrow comes flying through the air and lodges itself right in the middle of the young man's back. This kills him instantly. And while the entire group is coming to terms with what just happened, Cindy has already managed to find the culprit. She calls out for everyone to keep an eye on the roof in the top left corner of the shop, and Kittrick, without any hesitation, fires off his gun in the same direction. There seems to be a lone figure standing atop the rooftop, brandishing a crossbow, and when Stan and Cindy spot this, they fire shots at the lone figure. Stan's inner monologue tells us that it was already too late by the time any of the members had realized what they'd all just done. The bullets fired at the rooftop catch the unsuspecting figure directly in the back. And as the figure falls to the street for its impending death, we learn that it's a human woman. Cindy, however, is too busy managing the group to notice that it's a human woman. She orders Kittrick and Jeff to get on the roofs to scout the area, while the rest of them should ready themselves to be on the move within minutes. And that's when all hell breaks loose, as around 6 8-year-olds come running out of the shadows and screaming at the group to not shoot anymore. Cindy, Thomas, and Kittrick look on in horror as Stan holds his hand up in the air as a gesture of complying with the children's request. Stan then steps in front of the group as Cindy, Thomas, and Kittrick hesitate to take the shot. Cindy asks Stan what the hell he's doing, and Stan screams at the top of his lungs that the children aren't crossed. He continues proclaiming the same until panic subsides and the other 3 members of the group finally take in what they're looking at. The woman lying on the ground is human. Her back is riddled with bullet wounds, and the left side of her face is bloodied to a pulp due to the 5-story fall. Yet, despite her injuries, she begs for the group to not hurt the children. Stan then turns toward her and asks if the children belong to her, and the woman nods. The children, however, are quite aggressive and keep screaming for the group to not lay another finger on the woman. The woman then introduces herself to the group. She tells them that her name is Ann Cook, and that once, before the apocalypse started, she used to be the children's kindergarten teacher, Ann Cook, and that now, after so many months of this mayhem, she's all that's left. She's all they have in this horrific world. Stan and Cindy's eyes slowly droop as they realize what they've just done. The woman then musters all her strength to utter a few more words. She tells the group that there's a safe space nearby where they can find medical supplies. But before she can say any more, Stan interrupts her. He wants to know why she shot the group member who was caught in the bear trap. Cindy, meanwhile, checks in with Kittrick, who's on the roof and scouting the area. For now, there are no crossed around them for miles. Ann Cook, who still lies on the ground bleeding to death, tells Stan that she shot the man so that he'd stop screaming and avoid drawing attention to the entire area. She then goes on to tell them in broken words that this is what they do, trap and shoot. Not the crossed, but humans. And they lure them using food. And they do all this because feeding her and 6 children in a town like this is no easy task. But she never planned on her traps catching such a large group as theirs. It was usually meant for tiny groups or solo travelers. Stan is taken aback and promises the woman that they'd have shared some of their food with them if they'd asked. But Cindy realizes the implications of what the woman is saying. They weren't stopping survivors to get food for themselves. The survivors they captured were the food. Ann Cook and her 6 8-year-olds were cannibals. This same fact dawns on Stan moments later, who can do nothing but stare into the eyes of the 6 children confronting him. By nightfall, the group has managed to find a safe hideout under a bridge. It's an abandoned waterway no longer in use. Thomas sits as the lookout on the outside, while he snoops in on the conversation going on inside the tunnel. Cindy is busy talking to Ann Cook, who the group seem to have taken in along with her children. Cindy is confirming her doubts about their cannibalism, and Ann Cook has confessed. She even confesses that she taught the children how to trap and hunt, as she was the only adult there. But despite her confessions, every sentence she ends is followed by, "Please don't hurt them." For now, Cindy reassures her that no harm will come to the children, but there's a slight quiver in her voice, as though Cindy herself knows that this isn't actually true. 4 of the children are fast asleep in the background, while the 2 that seem to be leading them earlier are still awake and talking to each other. They're both boys, one with blonde hair and the other with black. Ann Cook then looks deep into Cindy's eyes and feels the disdain Cindy feels for her and the children, and confesses that they were starving for days, that there'd been no decent food for a week. So once they'd killed a survivor for the first time who wasn't carrying any food, they had no choice. No choice. What was she supposed to do? They're just children. She couldn't let these children die. But Cindy is as blunt as always. She tells Ann that she doesn't know what she was supposed to do, but she sure as hell wasn't supposed to kill fellow survivors, eat them, and turn herself and 6 little children into cannibals. Stan, meanwhile, has pulled Jeff aside. With Scott, the paramedic, now dead, Jeff is the closest they have to a medical specialist. He asks Jeff about Ann's health, who tells Stan that they've done the best they could, but he isn't a specialist like Scott. He can't identify major injuries nor comment on the fact if Ann would survive the night or not. Ann, meanwhile, is busy telling Cindy her story, trying to justify her actions. She now goes into the nitty-gritty. How, when it all started, she was in school with the children. At the time, each teacher took a few of the kids and hid with them. Over the next few weeks, they ate whatever they could find, but after a few more, Ann Cook could visibly see her children grow thinner and thinner with each passing day. And at that time, the Crossed were everywhere. Searching for food in public places was as good as suicide. Then they had 3 large groups of survivors pass through the town. Yet none of them even spared an ounce of food for the children. Then, when another week or so passed, winter arrived, and along with it brought a solo survivor. The man was rude and threatened to kill Anne. So, without a second thought, for her children, she shot the man. But the man wasn't carrying any food, and winter was upon them. So they did what they did. They ate the man. By now, Anne's face is full of tears. But despite this sad story, Cindy feels no remorse for her or the children. She goes on to tell Anne that it could have been a one-off thing, but they decided to make a habit out of it. Become just like the Crossed, hunting down any survivor they come across. Anne tries to reason with Cindy, telling her that it was all they could do. She couldn't travel from city to city with the children, go interstate. Their group has guns, while all Anne managed to scrounge from the remains was a measly crossbow and a few bolts that they had to reuse again and again. But Cindy has bigger concerns. She turns to look at the kids, and it seems Anne Cook knows exactly what Cindy's thinking. She grabs Cindy's hand while lying on the floor and begs for her to not blame the children. It wasn't their fault. It wasn't them. She begs Cindy to see her side, but Cindy's too busy calculating and formulating future plans in her head as she looks at the children. She sees the 2 boys that are awake looking at her, while as usual, Patrick is playing with his toy car in the foreground. However, it becomes clear to everyone what Cindy's thinking, because the very next second, she calls Patrick to her to get him away from those kids. Stan looks on dejectedly, but with an approving look as though he doesn't wish to alienate those kids, but no way in hell is he letting Patrick stay anywhere near them. And this is when Stan remembers the day they were captured by Officer Thomas, a deranged deputy that was driven to the brink of insanity by his need for order and discipline in this apocalyptic world. The group was traveling as usual, and not even a month had passed when they came across a horde of the Crossed, massacring and raping people across an entire highway. It was a week after Cindy had decided to stop using their pickup truck. These people that were being massacred had likely managed to avoid getting caught by hiding in their cars, or by simply driving away until this point. But now, the entire highway was jam-packed with cars with nowhere to run. Cindy, Stan, and Thomas look on in horror as they watch the highway turn into pits of massacre at every step. Patrick is in the background, and though he can hear everything, he's concentrating on playing with his toys. Kelly, meanwhile, sits with her back turned toward the highway. Hearing's enough for her. Even if her eyes were okay, there was no way in hell she wanted a glimpse of what the Crossed were doing to all the people. Stan coldly states that Cindy was right in ditching the truck a few weeks ago, and she simply nods. Soon, they talk and figure out that they need to leave this area fast, because these many people getting bitten will soon turn into the Crossed, which spells more trouble for their group. Way more trouble than they're prepared to handle. Thomas then takes a break from the group to attend to Kelly and offers her some water or anything else she might need. But for some reason, Kelly is in quite a bitter mood today. She tells Thomas no, rudely, and then goes on to state that she's gone blind, not retarded. She then falters and apologizes. Thomas understands her plight. He goes on to tell her that the blindness could be temporary in an attempt to reassure her, and that's when Kelly opens up to him. She asks him to look after her, to promise that he'll look after her. She goes on to confess that she has no right to ask this of him. She knows how rude she's been lately, how she's relied on him since the diner, how they barely know each other, and yet Thomas has done everything to help her along the way. She feels pathetic and angry at herself for having to ask this of Thomas. But during this apocalypse, with the Crossed around every corner and no eyes, blindness is a death sentence. Unless, of course, you have someone like Thomas. We can't hear Thomas's reply to Kelly as the next panel switches to the conversation happening between Stan and Cindy. But the last look on Thomas's face is more than enough to let us know what his reply was going to be. Stan and Cindy, meanwhile, are having a similarly heartfelt conversation. Stan is thanking Cindy for rescuing him, Thomas, and Kelly that day when they were suddenly attacked by a Crossed woman. Stan goes on to thank her and further claim that they would have been dead even after their rescue had it not been for Cindy and survival instincts. Cindy then goes on to tell that it's rather simple for her. She thinks, she decides, and then she simply acts on it. But she then goes on to tell him the most important thing is what you do next once you've acted. And all you do is drive on. Carry on without thinking or wondering too much about what you've done or how things turned out. Because if you get curious or wonder too much, you end up letting yourself be set up for an ambush, be set up for failure. Cindy then does a fake cough and goes back to looking at a map. She then tells Stan that no thanks is needed, and in one of those rare times, calls him slick. A slow smile spreads across Stan's face when he hears the same. Thomas and Kelly, meanwhile, too, have managed to make up. Thomas is holding Kelly's hand in his and is promising to take care of her, like he has as long as they're together in this journey. Suddenly, a loud, grumbly voice of a man echoes from behind them and is ordering them to not move a muscle while pointing a shotgun at them. Cindy, Stan, Thomas, and Kelly all are taken by surprise as Cindy quickly jumps to her feet and protects Patrick. The man pointing the gun is a police officer, who's also named Thomas, but for the sake of clarity, we'll call him Officer Thomas for the rest of the story. Officer Thomas spots Cindy eyeing her rifle and quickly orders every one of them to hand over their weapons. Even though they're all survivors, he trusts no one, considering what he's seen since the apocalypse started. Once he's taken their weapons, he orders Cindy to carry Patrick, while Thomas is allowed to help Kelly. He wants them all to follow him to his police cruiser, which is parked at the back of this hill. As they walk through the woods and finally approach Officer Thomas's cruiser, they spot more people who would go on to become the rest of their group hanging around the vehicle. Apparently, Officer Thomas caught them earlier. Stan leans into Cindy and asks her about her pistol, which she carries concealed in the holster. Officer Thomas doesn't know about it, and Cindy says that she's waiting for the right moment. She's waiting to see how things play out with Officer Thomas. Jeff is glad to see the rest of them and introduces himself to Stan and Cindy. Thomas, however, quickly interrupts him and asks Officer Thomas on what he plans to do with them. Officer Thomas then straightens up and in a deluded and pretentious voice tells them that he plans to restore order. He plans to reorganize any and every citizen that he can find. But from the first word he uttered, Cindy stopped paying attention. She knew he wasn't right in the head, and his words were only a confirmation of the same. She'd started scanning her surroundings the moment he started speaking, and then she found what she was looking for. In the back of the cruiser, where criminals are detained, is a crust, likely a prisoner that turned overtime. When she asks Officer Thomas about it, he scowls angrily, and after a moment's pause, simply says that it's a prisoner. There's some sort of pride in his voice, as though he's a hero for having captured a crossed person. Officer Thomas then tells them that he captured the guy for a DUI crash the day all this started. Since then, he doesn't care if he's turned into a crossed or not. He's a prisoner, and he'll be treated as such. Jeff sympathizes with the officer, but Cindy's frown is growing stronger and stronger with each passing second. Stan's flashback now comes to an end. It's now night, and the group is huddled in the same abandoned waterway that they were in previously. It's Kittrick who's keeping a lookout this time, and although his expression is stoic, tears are gushing down his face because of what he's hearing inside the tunnel. The group is discussing the fate of the children they carry, the ones left behind by Ann Cook because she succumbed to her injuries last night. Cindy wants to kill them off because of what they've been taught and how little they can provide for them. They all know that over the course of the next week or so, things are bound to go wrong, and they're bound to have an encounter with the crust, one way or the other. And when that happens, the children are going to be more than a liability, they're going to be fodder for the crust. And Cindy and Stan can't imagine the horrors they'll have to endure before being finally turned or killed off. Stan sits a bit away from the group as she discusses her plan with the rest of them. Thomas and Kelly aren't a fan of this decision, yet they know they have very little say in it. In the foreground, Jeff covers Ann Cook's body and packs up their medical supplies with a dejected look on his face. Jeff tries to defend Ann's wishes. He says she did right by the kids and was only surviving when she decided to cannibalize survivors. But Cindy then asks him to see the truth. That could be a story cooked up by Ann once she was shot and once she'd killed one of them. It could all be a story to cover her conscience while making sure the children survived. Would she have told them this sob tale if they had a smaller group or if they were traveling alone? Likely not. The kids and Ann would have feasted on their flesh without a second thought or explanation. And as Cindy finishes her explanation, she gets Kelly's vote. Thomas tries to protest, but Kelly tells him that Cindy's right. The only other choice they have is leaving the kids to fend for themselves. If they do that, then they either get turned, killed, or become like Ann and continue cannibalizing the survivors. Either way, each choice is worse, and the only merciful one seems to be the one Cindy is suggesting, to kill them. Jeff and Thomas try to protest, but then Cindy plays her non-negotiable card. It's non-negotiable for her to have these kids around Patrick, and that is the end of the conversation. The entire group packs up and walks out, while Stan stays behind with Cindy to pack up. Moments later, the group stands outside while Cindy stands alone inside the tunnel in the dark while the children are sleeping on the ground in front of her. Stan is outside holding Patrick's hand when something suddenly clicks in him and he rushes inside into the tunnel. By now, Cindy has begun carrying out the deed and has shot one kid. Bang, another one killed. By the time she reaches the third one, the rest of them are starting to wake up. They look up at Cindy in horror, but soon she's joined by Stan, and they both start shooting the children one by one quickly. Moments later, only the two aggressive boys remain standing, the ones that pretended to be their leaders. They weep relentlessly, but Stan and Cindy have come this far. They won't let them stop them now. Bang, bang. After 6 intermittent gunshots, it's all over. They take a moment of silence, which is only broken by Cindy's voice as she thanks Stan for joining her in this horrific act. Crossed issue number 4, The Old Man and the Stump. The group has continued their travel north and are now holed up in a seemingly abandoned apartment building. Cindy and Stan discuss their future travel plans as Patrick snores on the sofa beside Cindy. Stan wants to make a stop in Denver before crossing the Rockies for supplies, but Cindy shoots that opinion down. Big cities are a huge danger, and she isn't happy with their current hideout in the first place. They're boxed in, and their only escape route, the stairs, could easily be blocked by the crust if they manage to find them. The rest of the group is in the other room, and the two of them realize they aren't exactly on good terms with them. After all, the two of them recently murdered 6 children in cold blood. We see the entire group in the other room avoiding eye contact with them, while Cindy and Stan struggle to come to terms with what they did. Kittrick keeps a lookout with his back turned to them. Jeff is sleeping, and Thomas, Kelly, and Sheena sit huddled together, avoiding eye contact. Stan's monologue tells us that no matter how he justifies it, there's no way around the murders, as he remembers them in a flashback. Cindy tries to calm her mind by caressing Patrick, and Stan knows how she feels. After all, Patrick is turning out to be a great kid. Stan gets the feeling that Cindy wants to be alone, which is why he decides to take over from Kittrick and keep a lookout. Kittrick thanks him and walks away. And, true to his nature, as Stan keeps a lookout and is given time alone, he starts remembering the morning's events when Cindy and him were keeping a lookout. This was the dreaded day they came across an organized crew of the crust, the day he saw something that made him wonder if the crust were evolving. And the next page introduces us to the recurring villain of this series, Horsecock. And why is he named that? Horsecock is a large crossed man wielding a large, horse Johnson, if you will. The page starts by showing us Horsecock using his favorite weapon to smack another crossed member of his group right across the face. It's the next morning, and Cindy and Stan are stalking out this group of the crossed from a rooftop. Stan's baffled by the large man, while Cindy is more interested in why he just hit another crossed member. Was there some sort of hierarchy forming between them? The issue here is that Horsecock and his crew are standing between them and the only bridge leaving out of town. And what's more is that this group of the crossed seems to be up to something. They seem quite smart. Firstly, the large man hit the other crossed in the face because he was trying to rape the blonde woman, who's one of their prisoners. And surprisingly, though their prisoners seem to be beat up and cut up, none of them have been turned yet. And against all odds, all of them have their clothes intact. This group of the crossed either seems to be in control of their tendencies or is hatching a more devious plan. Cindy hates their only choice for escaping the city. They'll have to fight their way through Horsecock's group. Stan, on the other hand, tries to lighten her mood by pointing out that none of them have guns. Well, Stan had to jinx it, because that's when two more crossed members approached Horsecock's crew. An old shriveled man wearing nothing but a loincloth and another man whom he calls Stump. Why is he called Stump? Well, he has no arms, no legs, and is blind. So, pretty self-descriptive. The old man, in his hands, holds a large shotgun as he calls out Horsecock and demands to see what? Well, whatever Horsecock and his crew are planning to do with the captured survivors. But Horsecock denies their offer, and the two of them scream out a horrific cry, as though appalled and defiled by Horsecock's refusal. Horsecock then orders the two of them to continue their duty of keeping a lookout, and the two of them don't like this one bit, but reluctantly comply. The next moment, Stan and Cindy see what Horsecock and his crew had planned for the survivalists. They'd raped some and left some out, and this mixed bag of people was now being tossed into the back of a dumpster. Then, a huge bucket of knives was tossed inside the dumpster, and the crew was waiting for a match to the death between those that were about to turn into the crust and those that were uninfected. Cindy was right. This is just another devious game, another kind of mean, more horrific one that the crust came up with. Stan doesn't like this one bit. The thought of the crust organizing themselves and showing such restraint sends shivers down his spine. Cindy doesn't like it one bit. And the two of them hightail it out of the rooftop the next second. Stan remembers how seeing Horsecock and his crew become organized reminded him again of Officer Thomas, and how what happened that day first made him wonder if the crust were evolving. We now continue the flashback of Officer Thomas where we left it in the previous issue, the time when Officer Thomas introduced us to the crossed prisoner he'd locked up in the back of his police cruiser. The crossed prisoner in the back seat of the police cruiser is taunting Officer Thomas menacingly. Cindy's growing weary and tired of Officer Thomas's stubbornness. She bluntly asks him why he's keeping the crossed prisoner alive, and then, with a dark and angry look, he tells her that the prisoner knew stuff about Officer Thomas's wife, said horrific things they'd done to her when turning her, and after they turned her. Meanwhile, the rest of the group is busy discussing how they should get out of the city. This flashback is of the time when Joel and Amy were still alive and a part of the group. Stan asks the group if they managed to get the crossed prisoner to talk, but Jeff tells him that they're all too scared to get close to him. Officer Thomas, however, had been brave enough to feed it water in order to keep it alive. Stan's sleeve is then tugged by Patrick, who wants to ask him something. But next, we focus on Officer Thomas and Cindy. Officer Thomas is busy recounting what the crossed man said to him about his wife, how she was helpless, how they used her and changed her, and he continues to babble on, lost in his own thoughts while Cindy desperately tries to get his attention. She tells him that he's being played by the crossed prisoner. He's being harassed mentally. The creature doesn't know his wife's name. He only guessed Officer Thomas had a wife by looking at the ring on his finger. Back in the group, Amy has been constantly trying to bring to everyone's attention that Arwen hasn't eaten in days. But nobody would listen to her, not even Joel. It's then that we see what Patrick wanted from Stan. He wanted his yogurt, which he's now offering to Arwen. Back near the police cruiser, Officer Thomas loudly screams no, and a heated shouting match begins between him and Cindy. Cindy wants him to shoot the crossed prisoner, but Officer Thomas wants to uphold the law. They don't shoot prisoners who are in custody. Cindy tries to reason with him, but Officer Thomas, who Cindy suspected had lost his mind, is now reaching for his gun. And that's when the crossed prisoner begins laughing at the top of his lungs. This grabs Officer Thomas's attention, and he turns all his anger at the crossed prisoner. He abuses and curses the prisoner as he gets in the front seat to ask him face to face what do the crossed want. But this was a mistake, because the crossed maintains Officer Thomas's attention by talking about his wife and then takes his chance and spits in the officer's eye. It's over. Officer Thomas has been infected, but in retaliation, he shoots the cross prisoner directly in the head. Cindy tries to calm him down as he gets out of the cruiser, but as soon as he hears her voice, he takes aim and shoots at her. Cindy manages to jump out in the nick of time, and thankfully the officer is momentarily blinded, which allows her to gather her thoughts. She reaches for her pistol, while Officer Thomas shoots his gun blindly, ordering everyone to stay back and stay away from their weapons which he'd confiscated earlier. The officer then falls to his knees to reload his revolver, and Cindy takes this chance to shoot the cross prisoner in the head again to ensure he stays dead. Everyone in the group is down on their bellies to avoid Officer Thomas's frantic firing, as Cindy slowly creeps up on him in the background. But it's already too late, because when he turns his face around, he sports the same deranged smile as every other crust. He's been turned. But Cindy isn't taking any chances. Before Officer Thomas can even move a muscle, Cindy shoots him twice, directly in the head. Thomas and another member of the group look horrified as Cindy orders Stan to check the cars for any supplies and weapons that they can use on their journey. She then orders the rest of the group to gather everything and pack up, while ensuring they stay away from the blood and bodies of the infected at all costs. Stan has now snapped out of his flashback as the sun rises over the horizon in the apartment building they're currently using as a temporary base. His inner monologue, however, continues. He tells us that Officer Thomas wasn't the only deranged serviceman they encountered even before he turned. He tells us about Sheena's past, how she used to be a part of a group of survivalists that were mostly cops and firefighters. The lack of control eventually caused all of them to lose their minds. She was the only survivor left because one night they decided to capture a crossed and beat it till it told them what the crossed wanted. Stan has now given up his lookout duty and Thomas has taken over. He now sits with the group and tells them about Horsecock and his crew and what they saw yesterday when they were scouting the location. The crew then starts debating if the crossed are actually evolving. Some speculate it could just be an isolated incident, but Sheena quickly adds that they've seen the crossed learn new skills and pass them on in the past. What if they're all indeed evolving? And then Kelly hits them with a hard-hitting thought. What if the crossed are just people? She then goes on to speculate, what if they're just like people? Some are highly organized, while some act upon their impulses. It would explain what Randall saw when the cross turned on one of their own, and explain what Cindy and Stan saw with Horsecock and his crew today. Jeff and the rest of them are now speculating more, and the more they overthink, the more scared they get. Cindy asks them to stop because this isn't helping. They're now looking for a rule book, just like Joel, but they all know there isn't any. Thomas is tired of Cindy's blunt attitude and plainly asks her that if she's so sure, then she's bound to have a plan. And indeed, Cindy does have a plan. She plans to wait for midnight and then cross the bridge under the cover of darkness. She doesn't wait for Thomas's approval and instead replies to him with a cold stare of her own. A few hours have passed, and the group has now managed to reach the bridge without being spotted. Sadly, a huge section of the bridge has been blown off, and a single large metal beam is the only way across it. Many of the members are scared, but they have to do what needs to be done. Thomas is the first one to cross the beam, and although it's a bit loose, he manages to get across it without any incident. The next panel shows us Horsecock and his crew huddled around a fire, hungrily feasting on the flesh of the people that got killed in their recent game of survival in the dumpsters. It's then that Stump turns his head towards the bridge as if he noticed something. The next second, Stump lets out a guttural scream as though he senses the presence of the survivors on the bridge. Turns out that having his limbs cut and being blinded has its perks. He now has heightened hearing and listening capabilities, which allow him to act like a radar. His scream is heard by Sheena, who's one of the last survivors to cross the beam. In front of her is Jeff, who's leading Kelly slowly across the beam. Stan looks at Cindy, and she knows this means that Horsecock and his crew are on their way here. She asks Patrick to climb onto her back as she prepares for the confrontation. Kelly and Jeff have a long way to go, and Kelly has picked the worst time to panic. She comes to a standstill as Jeff desperately tries to get us across the beam. Sheena, meanwhile, who's still on the other end waiting for Kelly and Jeff to get across, now spots Horsecock and his crew running towards them, screaming at the top of their lungs. Stan and Cindy are already in position, aiming their rifles at the approaching crew, while Jeff is still urging Kelly to move forward and take baby steps. Sheena has started to panic in the background and is hurling abuse at Kelly for picking the worst time to panic and come to a standstill. Thomas now joins the effort to try and urge Kelly to move on and cross the beam. His words and his voice seem to hit a mark as Kelly slowly starts edging forward. However, Horsecock and his crew are sprinting toward them with guns in hand, and they only have a minute to themselves now before they're upon the group. As soon as they're in range, Cindy and Stan start firing their rifles. Jeff has now managed to cross the beam, and Kelly is now a mere feet away from safety. Sheena is screaming for Kelly to take the leap, but she's still too slow. Kelly desperately jumps towards Thomas's voice and makes it across safely. However, the impact of her leaping loosens the beam, which slowly slides down on the other end where Sheena is standing. Cindy asks Stan to keep Horsecock and his crew out of pistol range as Sheena climbs down onto the unsteady beam in a desperate attempt to get across it. However, her weight is enough for the beam to give way, and that's it. Sheena's hope of crossing the bridge is completely lost. She desperately hangs on to the broken section of the bridge as the rest of the group watches in horror. But there's no time for gawking. Horsecock and his crew will begin shooting any moment, which is why Cindy orders them to take cover instantly. Sheena desperately tries to climb back onto the bridge, but when she spots the approaching crew of the Crossed, she stops midway. Cindy knows exactly what she's thinking, which is why she calls out to her, "Sheena, do you want me to take the shot?" Horsecock and his crew are now mere feet away from Sheena, and the sight of their horrific and ugly faces sends shivers down her spine. Sheena knows what she needs to do. There's no point wasting a bullet for her. She winces, closes her eyes, and lets go. She kills herself before the crew can get to her. Stan watches with misty eyes. Sheena plummets to her death. Cindy and Stan then make a run for it the next second as they hear Horsecock and his crew call after them in the background. They're promising to chase them down. They seem to recognize them both. They call Cindy the bitch with the brat and Stan the four-eyed clown. The mention of these nicknames scares Stan and Cindy for a second, but they dare not stop now. They continue running while leaving Horsecock and his crew seething with anger at the other end of the bridge in their wake. Cross issue number 5, Budding Relationships. This issue is a calm one that shows us the budding relationships between the group and how far they've come since the first time they met each other, thanks to late Officer Thomas. However, as this issue doesn't add much to our main plot, we'll quickly go over what's happening in this issue. The group has reached the Rockies, and it's now winter. They have the appropriate gear to muster through the harsh cold, and there's no sign of the Crossed for miles around. The fresh air and the renewed sense of safety has put everyone at ease. The only issue they face is with Jeff and Kittrick. Jeff is a bit sick and has a weak immune system to properly navigate this harsh cold, while Kittrick has lost the will to live, something he struggled with since he joined them. The group discusses nuclear power plants, how the government somehow managed to shut them down before everything was taken over, how nations around the world managed to show restraint as no nukes had gone off in the country, how it was only Israel that they knew of where every nuke had fired off, destroying the entire Middle East. Stan tries to get closer to Cindy by calling out her cold nature, by pointing out how nice she is with Patrick and how she has a soft heart on the inside. Cindy gives him a chance to get to know her, but then goes back to being her cold self, because the day she stops being this is the day her and Patrick are killed off. Stan then remembers how, after killing Officer Thomas, the entire group had stuck together, how dynamics and hierarchies were formed quickly, and how Cindy had been blunt and clear to them that if they wanted to accompany her, it was her way or the highway. How Thomas and him had become close friends since the diner, and how Thomas had decided to confide in Stan that he was gay. This revelation didn't affect their friendship one bit, how it was the first the group had discussed the Crossed, and how they all had different opinions. Some thought it was God's doing, some thought it was a malicious corporation, and how some thought it was just nature running its due course. How, once the flashback was over, Stan could witness firsthand how close he, Kelly, and Thomas had become. They could joke around, take digs at each other, and make this apocalypse a little more bearable. That night, when they traveled, Stan even got to spend a night alongside Patrick and Cindy, looking at stars and a pack of white wolves. Cindy had even confided in him that this was the first time she got to spend a few precious moments with Patrick, how they'd been on the run all their life, and these first precious moments were all due to this horrid apocalypse. Crossed issue number 6, Kittrick's Past and Jeff's Dark Secret. This issue opens up with the first page dedicated to a single panel. It shows a scared horse galloping through the forest with slashes and cuts all over its body. Attached to a chain hanging by the saddle on its back is a single dismembered leg of a human being. We then see Cindy and the rest of the group hiding in the bushes, lying on their belly, waiting for whatever is chasing down the horse. The group now has a new member amongst them, Brett, a loud-mouthed male in his early 30s that's being tolerated by the group for the precious food and medical supplies he carries. He wants to get out and run for it once the horse is out of sight, but he's too dumb, and Cindy asks him to shut up. The next second, Brett sees why, because following the horse's bloody trail is a large group of the Crossed. They continue, walking together in a group carrying knives and guns, while an isolated Crossed follows behind them carrying a baseball bat. He doesn't seem to be a part of their crew, which could be the reason why they all turn toward him menacingly when they hear him approaching. The supposed leader then uses his machete to slice a part of his skull off, which sends the slightly decapitated man with his brain sticking out flying to the ground. As the Crossed man bleeds out on the ground, he laughs menacingly because he's face to face with Stan, who's horrified to his core. Stan is about to shoot the Crossed, but Cindy desperately holds his gun back. She asks him to keep quiet and not give away their positions, as the Crossed continues to bleed out a mere 5 to 6 inches away from them. Soon, the group has passed, and the maniacal laughter of the bleeding out Crossed fades away. As the group vanishes in the distance, so does the Crossed in front of them bleed out and die. They continue waiting until an hour has passed, and then Cindy orders them all to get up and get ready to leave. Once they know they're safe, Brett can't help but tease Stan for the look he sported on his face when the crust fell mere inches away from him. Stan doesn't like Brett one bit, but they need him, which is why he doesn't pick a fight. Well, at least not now. He gives Brett a mean look and continues packing, while the other pokes and prods at the dead crossed man on the ground playfully. Stan's monologue then tells us that Jeff and Kittrick both survived a harsh winter thanks to each other. Once George got better, he helped Kittrick get through each day. The man fed him, bathed him, helped him stay up on his feet as the latter slowly lost his will to die. The group is walking silently, and it's only the loud-mouthed Brett that has something to say. And right now, he has a problem with Kittrick and his lack of will to live.
He's the most miserable person I've seen. What is it with him? I mean, I know the world's changed, but get over it. How the hell is his moping around and bumming us out meant to help us at all?
He then looks at the people in the group menacingly, as though itching to pick a fight. But like an undisciplined dog, he's ignored by all of them. Neither Stan nor Cindy, or anyone else for that matter, even look at him. We then see what has depressed Kittrick all this while. It was the way he lost his family. They were out on vacation, and he was swimming out in the sea when his family was attacked on the beach. He was too far and too helpless to do anything about it. He first watched his wife get decapitated, and then saw more crossed approach and hack his boy and girl to pieces. And when he was just about to reach the shore, a crossed policeman appeared and started firing at him. This forced Kittrick to swim underwater and get away, but the crossed had another traumatic event in store for him, because as he was swimming away, a large object came and splashed on his back and slowly began turning the water red. And when Kittrick saw what it was, his heart sank. It was the severed head of his wife. Stan remembers the first time Kittrick told them this story of what had happened. It was like he was jabbering, itching to let it out, itching to let this version of him die. Because the next morning, once Kittrick woke up, he was a different man altogether. The man that they now see with them. By now, the group has found a house to rest in for the night. Cindy, Stan, Brett and Jeff are discussing their next approach as they near the Canadian border. Patrick sleeps in Kelly's lap while Kittrick sits in the background, motionless. Cindy and Stan negate Randall's idea of sailing the seas to reach Alaska. Firstly, because none of them know how to sail, and secondly, because they can be easily spotted from the land in a boat. Brett then wants to know why they wish to avoid the Canadian border, and Stan tells him about the entire army which was crossed on the border when they sealed it off. Brett calls bullshit, but before the building tension between Brett and Stan finally erupts into an argument, Cindy brings their attention back to the need for a new plan. Cindy points out that they should avoid the coast and the big cities, because it'll box them in from one side and exponentially increase the possibilities of encountering the crust. There's silence for a while, as nobody has a good idea, when suddenly Jeff chimes in and suggests the desert. Jeff suggests turning northwest across Utah and Nevada, which would keep them away from the Sierras. There'll be lots of open space, and desert is harsh conditions for the crust. Brett, being the obnoxious a-hole that he is, screams at Jeff about the hardships they'd face. But before he can go on ranting, Stan asks if Brett has a better plan. The impending argument between the two has now begun. Stan calls Brett a whiny witch, while the latter goes on to recount all the food and water he's lent to the group. The heated argument is about to wake up Patrick, but Kelly diligently lulls the 8-year-old back to sleep. The argument has now turned into a screaming match, and the two of them are about to lunge at each other when Cindy says, "You two are boring me." This shuts up the two of them for good, and Cindy tells them Jeff's plan is a good one. All they need to do is plan their supplies and manage them accordingly, especially water. Stan then talks about the bacteria-killing tablets that can help them purify dirty water, and Brett starts his whining again. He can't believe the things Stan's saying, and Stan has had enough and is about to do something stupid. But before he can act, Cindy steps in and reminds him that he's supposed to relieve Thomas of his lookout duty, and without a word, Stan walks away. Brett sports a wide grin on his face, unaware that Cindy might have just saved his life. Stan relieves Thomas of his duty and tells him of their plan to cross the desert. Thomas doesn't really mind the plan. The group has been through a lot and he trusts in their capabilities. Before he leaves, he tells Stan the dog is back again. Apparently, an uninfected dog has been visiting them at this location and seems to be growing fond of them. And as Stan takes a seat, it comes bounding up to him. Stan has a soft spot for dogs, which is why he tries to ignore it so that he doesn't get attached. But once he takes a look at the dog's puppy eyes, he gives in. Before long, the two of them have befriended each other, and the dog now diligently sits beside Stan as he keeps a lookout. However, the happiness he felt due to his new friend soon faded away when the group realized what he was planning. They've traveled further towards the desert, and Brett is now the one on the lookout duty. Cindy and Stan debate in the background, and Cindy isn't happy about the dog. She tells him that the dog's food comes out of Stan's rations, and Stan better be ready to shoot it in case it barks at the wrong time. Without a second thought, Stan agrees to all these terms, and this is the first time Cindy's seen him take charge and be so sure about something. They all sit in silence for a while, which is broken by Patrick asking the dog's name. Stan and the rest of them smile as they try to come up with a name for the dog. He never had any in his life, and despite the apocalypse, he's kinda glad for it, because it finally got him some new friends and nice moments with them. Stan then asks more about why Jeff never had friends, and Jeff asks his permission to open up. Stan thanks them for allowing them to open up and then starts telling the group about himself. Jeff is from a small town, and being different there was a way to get bullied unless you gave in and were ready to conform to the ways of the people. Thomas immediately relates to what Jeff is saying. After all, he was a gay man. He even relates when Jeff tells them that he used to pick up young men and take them back home. Thomas places his hand on Jeff's shoulder and continues to console him until Jeff confesses what happened next. Instead of the obvious, Jeff would torture and cut up the young men he used to pick up, torture them till they were dead. And then, once they were gone, he would bury their remaining pieces under his house. Each and everyone in the group recoils in horror. This is a huge bomb for anyone, but especially Thomas, who can't believe he was consoling this man. Stan and Thomas are sitting on either side of Jeff with a horrific expression on their faces as Jeff tells them about the night he picked up a young man, the same night the crossed epidemic had begun. Jeff took the young man back to his place, but by the time he was strapped down and ready to be tortured, he turned and became infected. He was screaming at Jeff to torture him, to get on with it. This scared Jeff to his core, and he fled his house, leaving the crossed man tied up in his torture chamber. While reciting and recounting all this, Jeff hasn't looked up once to see how the others in the group feel, because thankfully by now, most of them have managed to regain their composure. Thomas turns away in disgust, while Cindy asks Patrick to get behind her. Jeff finally looks up and watches Cindy pulling Patrick away. Panicking at the thought of losing his new supposed friends, Jeff says that he would never do such a thing to any of them, never lay a finger on them because they're his friends. But the others, everyone in the group, can only take the name of the Lord and recoil in horror and disgust. Only one man calls out to Jeff, and it's Kittrick. By now, Jeff is weeping relentlessly, and Kittrick draws him in for a warm embrace. Jeff continues weeping, and Cindy understands the look Kittrick's giving her. Come next morning, Jeff and Kittrick went out for a nice walk, but only Kittrick returned, and everyone knew what had happened. 5 days after this, the group began its tiring journey through the desert. Crossed issue number 7, Mommy's Little Boy. This comic opens up on the first page dedicated to a single panel. It showcases the returning antagonist of the series, Horsecock and his crew, including the Stump. The theory that the cross can and are surely evolving holds up true in this panel, because they're all singing a song in chorus. We could have been anything we wanted to be, with all the talent we had. No doubt about it, we fight and we tout it. We're the very best at being bad guys. As the crew sings this, Stump grunts and screams loudly as though trying to match their beat. They're in the desert. Stan and Cindy are horrified to come across them as they scout the area before marching ahead. The crew has followed them all this way and isn't afraid to go after them, even in the desert. Stan can't believe his eyes. Cindy can't fathom that it's Horsecock's crew from 2 months ago. The one they left across the bridge, almost 1,000 miles away, the day they lost Sheena. Stan is unsure if they tracked them, but Cindy looks on with a scared look on her face because she too fears the same. If this crew can track them, then they're in huge trouble. When they get back to camp, we see the rest of the group has been holed up in a gas station. Stan and Cindy have rushed in and have ordered everyone to pack up. The rest of them want to stay, as there can be more supplies inside, but they can't take any chances. That's when they spot that the group left the generator running, which could be like a homing beacon for the crust. Brett rushes to turn off the generator, while Thomas, Kelly, Cindy, Stan and Kittrick wait outside. They sync up their radios and get ready to leave. Despite their initial intentions of staying clear off the roads, they have no choice but to follow it for now. Stan wants to know why Cindy wants to take the road, as it'll be longer, and Cindy tells him that it'll make it harder for them to track the group. The group continues to discuss that it's baffling for a crew of the Cross to follow them 1,000 miles and track them in a desert. But then, this new world of the apocalypse has always been full of surprises. They travel the road until it's nightfall, when Cindy decides to check their back. She was surprised when she saw lights, and this made Stan halt and take a look as well. The entire crew is now growing tense in the dark, as Stan and Cindy try to confirm what the light in the distance is. They realize it's the gas station they were at, going up in flames. Stan thinks it's just like the Cross to blow up a gas station for the fun of it, but Cindy is catching on. If these guys are smart enough to track them all this way, they might be using the light from the gas station to improve their chances of spotting the group. Patrick, too, has been growing uneasy all this while, and Stan's dog is the only thing reassuring him all these days. The next panel shows us what's happening at the gas station. Even though Horsecock's crew is smarter and has shown restraint, they still seem to be slaves to the inane desires of the crust, because the entire crew has chained up one of their own and is tossing him into the fire to be cooked. It's what everyone does at night. They're preparing dinner. Once the man is charred and cooked enough, they pull him out using the hot chain. But then suddenly, Stump seems to sniff the air as though he's caught onto a scent, and the next second he lets out the same loud, high-pitched shriek that had alerted the group when they were discovered on the bridge where they lost Sheena. And when they hear the same scream again, Stan and Cindy don't need their binoculars to see what's happening. because in the pitch black of the darkness of the night, what once used to be a huge flame of the gas station seems to give birth to 8 to 15 smaller lights that swiftly start heading in the group's direction. They've been discovered, and Cindy orders everyone to move quickly. Over the next 2 days, the group extended itself beyond measure. They slept a total of 2 hours each day, covered as much ground as they could, and despite having exhausted their water supply, none of them seemed to be really affected by this. Brett is still the a-hole he is. He's now pestering Kelly about her blindness, hoping that, like Stump, she might have developed superhuman hearing. Thomas takes a quick jab at Brett once Kelly shuts him down, but Brett doesn't back away that easily. He goes on to speculate that if what they're saying is true, then Stump's powers surely outweigh the distance they've managed to put between them and their pursuers. Sooner or later, they might catch up, and this is a rare moment, because for once since he joined the group, Brett might actually be right. Cindy, too, seems to agree with Brett, but then reminds everyone that there's no way Stump actually tracked them this far. Like his lookout duty, they might only use Stump when they suspect uninfected people to be nearby. To have followed the group this far, they likely have a law enforcement officer or hunter amongst their midst who is an expert tracker. They're now only 5 miles away from a river, according to the map, and that's when they can replenish their water supply. Things are looking up for Stan and the rest of them, but you can count on Brett to spoil it all. Brett makes fun of Stan being called a four-eyed clown by Horsecock, but before Stan can say anything, Brett has briskly walked away. Cindy soon catches up to him, but reminds him how he liked to torture Joel just like this back in the day. An hour or so later, they've now reached the river. The group is making their way across the river while Brett has gone ahead to scout out the terrain. Thomas is speculating whether the crossed made Stump the way he is, or whether they cut off limb after limb until his hearing and smelling senses were at the peak of their abilities, but it's all speculation for now. They couldn't exactly go and ask the crossed how they did it. Stan then asks Brett over the radio if he sees anything. And being the a-hole that he is, Brett quips back at him that he would have told them if there was any danger. Stan is about to go to town on Brett when he hears Brett scream out in horror. On a hilltop behind them, he spotted Horsecock and his crew only a few meters away from the group. Brett had one job, but he's failed at that too. The crew is bombarded with sharp sticks, arrows and bullets the very next second. Each one of them tries to jump and dodge out of the way, but most of them stumble on the rocks and fall down in the water. One of the bullets manages to hit Kittrick in the shoulder, while Cindy manages to lose her grip on Patrick. The little kid washes away in the current of the river, while Cindy desperately wades after to rescue him. Despite Cindy's determination, the current is too fast, and with each passing second, Patrick is moving away and away from her. Stan takes aim at Horsecock's crew and begins firing, as he tells Cindy to make it to the bank and then follow after Patrick. But Cindy is too pissed off. She too takes aim at the crew and begins firing all she's got. The rest of the crew has managed to reach the bank and are laying suppressive fire, as Thomas orders Stan and Cindy to get out of the water and get their priorities straight. Despite his shoulder, Kittrick is unloading his weapon with great anger at Horsecock's crew. The group regroups, but before they can catch their breath, Cindy starts running down the riverbank in pursuit of her son. Stan runs after her, and a few hundred yards down the line, the two of them sit scouting the area for any signs of Patrick. She knows her son. Cindy has taught him well. She knows he'll latch onto a safe space in the river and wait for her to rescue him. The rest of the crew too has now managed to catch up to them as they try to gather their bearings. Thomas patches up Kittrick while Brett whines and cries about himself. Thomas knows Horsecock's crew is learning as they progress in their pursuit. The reason they're not pursuing them is because they know they'll be shot dead by them if they try to cross the river. They're likely going to attack at night. Brett, who was nowhere to be seen during the attack, has now stepped out of the shadows and is crying about how he could have been shot dead back there. He begs for them to go and abandon Patrick, and this is when Stan screams at him to shut up and leave if he's so desperate and scared. Suddenly, their radio pops up, and it's Horsecock's voice on the other end. He tells them that they have Patrick, and Stan realizes they've got hold of his radio, the one he dropped during the scuffle on the river. Cindy rushes toward the radio, and her whole face contorts with fury as Horsecock goes into excruciating detail of what they've done to Patrick, how they violated him, and after they were done, how they're going to kill him. Horsecock continues laughing. Before Stan can get a hold of Cindy, she started sprinting towards the last known location of Horsecock's crew. But then Kittrick takes the radio and starts screaming at Horsecock, which stops Cindy dead in her tracks, because Kittrick is demanding proof. If they really have Patrick and haven't killed him yet, then they need to put him on the radio to prove it. Cindy's heart sinks. It's the exact way the captured Cross was torturing Officer Thomas after knowing that he was married. Kittrick continues screaming for Horsecock to put Patrick on the radio, but for the next few minutes, there's only dead silence. Kittrick continues to scream, and after minutes of silence, Horsecock tells them that they've just killed Patrick. Kittrick seems to have caught their bluff and plays it right back at Horsecock. He threatens to kill them all if they ever find them, because if they had Patrick, they could have proved it right here and right now. Cindy gathers herself and wants to head out to find Patrick before it's too dark. But that's when all hell breaks loose, at least for Brett. He cries out in terror as he spots a bunch of the Crossed crossing the river, headed straight at them. Kittrick, on the other hand, has had enough of running. Despite his hurt shoulder, he brandishes his pistol and screams at all of them to let go and finally kill this crew that's been haunting their travels. Before he can even head down the hill, Cindy's already sprinted ahead of him without saying a word. Soon, Stan and Thomas follow them, leaving only Brett and Kelly behind. Stan's inner monologue tells us that this was the release they'd all been waiting for. A release for all their frustration and anger. Reluctantly, Brett soon joins the group a moment later, and each one of their faces is contorted with fury and the hunger for revenge. Except Brett's, of course. He's scared and terrified to his core. The crew of the Crossed are heading in a different direction than them, but soon they're called out by Cindy and the rest of them. Before the Cross can turn around and realize what's happening, they're peppered with dozens of bullets the very next second. Once they're all dead, Cindy finally spots Patrick in the distance. Her heart groans a sigh of relief, but her entire body screams her son's name out loud. She then runs toward him without a second thought, but when Patrick turns toward her, it's already too late. The poor boy has been infected and turned into the monster that she dreaded all this while. The cross rash is prominently displayed across his face as he hurls unmentionable curses and abuses at his loving mother. But the next second, his entire head explodes into pieces as Cindy shoots him point blank without a second thought. Her face, however, is desperately hanging on, every muscle in her body using every ounce of her strength to stop a single tear from leaving her eyes. Stan, however, isn't this strong. He lets out a yelp as he watches his little buddy get shot by his own mother. His eyes moisten instantly, yet he holds back tears when he watches Cindy walking back. She's now colder than ever, and she walks dead across them without saying a word. Thomas and Kelly finally reach them, begging for any information on what happened after they found Patrick, but neither Kittrick nor Stan have the willpower to say a single word. Stan looks at Thomas and then at Patrick's dead body, and that's all everyone needs to know. Thomas and Kelly are scared, horrified, and sad at the same time, but Stan doesn't give them a second to grieve. He orders them to gather their belongings, because they're leaving immediately. Kelly desperately asks Thomas what's happened, and he promises to tell her everything once they've left. Right now, they need to leave, and leave this place as soon as possible. Brett is confused because he figured Cindy might want to bury him, but Stan simply lowers his head and tells Brett that he can bet that Cindy doesn't even want to look at his body right now. The radio finally buzzes up again, and it's Horsecock's voice coarsely having a fit of laughter on the other end. In frustration, Thomas smashes the radio on the ground, as Stan looks up only to watch Cindy around 100 yards away from them, making her way further on into the desert. Crossed issue number 8, The Army, Brett's End and Redemption. The group has now been walking for days, and Cindy hasn't talked to them since the incident. She always walks a few feet ahead of them while Stan leads the rest of them and Brett watches the back. None of them have talked much, and Thomas's anxiety causes him to blurt out that at least they won't have to hold back their swear words anymore now that Patrick's gone. A sudden wave of terror washes over all of them, and they all stop dead in their tracks. Stan looks up at Thomas in disgust as he tries to apologize profusely for his comment. Stan doesn't say anything, but when he looks ahead, Cindy has stopped too. She had heard Thomas. Kelly then changes the topic and starts discussing if Horsecock and his crew are still following them. Brett winces as he speculates that after the tracking and the mind games they witnessed at the river, all bets are off. Anything is possible now. It's been raining heavily, and when they reach the next river that they're supposed to cross, they take a moment to weigh their chances. The water is steadily rising, and going around is not a luxury they can afford. But risking going in the river right now means broken bones, and staying in the rain means pneumonia. And so they look around for shelter and soon find a crashed helicopter. Without a second thought, Cindy heads inside and takes the pilot's seat for herself. She soon falls asleep while the rest of them occupy the cabin. It's an army helicopter, and aside from them, there's another passenger aboard, the corpse of a single dead soldier. Kelly asks about Cindy, and Stan tells her that she hasn't eaten or changed her clothes since the incident. But the moment anyone tries to get close to her, they get a death stare so deep that they've now stopped trying. Brett, meanwhile, is busy enjoying his finds in the helicopter. Slightly rusted rifles that he believes he can fix to get them working again. In his haste to ogle at his new treasure, he doesn't realize he's pointing the trigger at Stan, who expertly points it away. Stan's dog then starts sniffing at Brett, who shoos it away in disgust. Brett and Stan then start having an argument again. Brett says at least he's trying to help by looking on the positive side. He isn't like the rest of them, sitting around and moping all day. When Stan quips back at him that it's got to be easy for him because he only cares for himself, Brett crosses the line. He says that Stan is only pretending to be sad because now he won't be able to get inside Cindy's pants. Stan is shook, and the artist uses the same black background to signify the rage building up inside Stan, the same background that's used for the crust. Stan has jumped to his feet the next second, and so has Brett, but before they can go ahead, Kittrick joins the conversation and eases things by telling Brett to put the gun he's holding down. The gun has a grenade launcher attached to it, and if he's not careful, he could blow them all to smithereens. Things quiet down over the next hour or so, and Thomas takes the lookout duty. Brett and Kittrick have gone to sleep, while Stan is rummaging around the helicopter to find anything useful. Any supplies. He talks with Kelly, who keeps him company, when he finds a Bible in the dead soldier's pocket. He hates Bibles, but when he opens it up, he finds words handwritten across every empty page that he can find. It's a diary, the diary of the dead soldier in the helicopter. The diary of Captain Michael Alexander Junot of the United States Army. Over the next few hours, Stan reads the captain's journal and learns a lot about what the Army did once the C virus broke out. Everyone has gone to sleep, everyone except Thomas and Stan. Stan learns from the diary that the captain and his crew were tasked to escort a group of scientists across the country so that they could disable any and all nuclear reactors and nuclear warheads. The captain hated escorting the scientists around because they were like little kids, bickering among themselves as to how they should tackle the next site without a care for all the dangers they faced. And although the captain's unit encountered hostile crossed humans at every step, they managed to accomplish their mission in the end. The captain then recalls how, after the final mission, each base they landed at was strapped for soldiers, and each head of department seemed to be losing faith, how the mere mention of a classified mission would irk each official, and how the next part of his mission didn't please him one bit either, because after everything was done, he was ordered to kill each scientist, because from what they'd seen, the Cross retained their skills, and if these scientists turned, they had the power to undo the changes they did to the nuclear facilities. The Army couldn't chance that happening, and so the captain and his crew shot and killed each scientist. Till this point, the captain and his crew were working like a machine, because they had orders, but now that it was all done, they were free to think. The captain was free to lead his men. But even before the captain could decide, the chopper our group of survivors is holed up in, was hit by a devastating storm. They desperately jettisoned most of their equipment and managed to land rather safely in the storm. Only the flying crew's chief had died, while the captain had broken both his legs. And although his crew volunteered to carry the captain in their search for civilization, he denied them and ordered them to leave without him. It was an emotional goodbye, but his men finally left him in the chopper. They wanted to leave him a few medical supplies, but the captain knew his fate and ordered them to take any and all supplies they would need. In his last moments, the captain hopes that what he and his men had done for the country, what they'd done to the scientists, was all worth it. He signs off the last entry by remembering his country and family, and hoping that he was a good man all around. By the time Stan is done reading the diary, his eyes are filled with tears. By evening, the storm had subsided, and the group had left the safety of the chopper and headed northwest for a week. Stan kept tabs on Cindy, who didn't eat a morsel of food all this while. Her body was functioning on pure adrenaline. Over the past week, she didn't sleep with them or talk to them, and Stan knew if it carried on this way, he'd lose her. But by now, the entire group had grown used to this, and they seemed to be caring less and less with each passing minute. Cindy, too, started looking different. Her clothes were shabby, and her hair was no longer neatly tied up. Hell once again broke loose once they camped for a night. They were short on food supplies, while Brett was hungrily chowing down on his personal quota. Cindy sits on a hill a good 50 to 80 yards away from them, while Thomas checks Cindy's eyesight. Suddenly, Stan's dog tries to sniff at Brett in order to get some food, but the a-hole kicks him in the guts. Thomas and Kelly scream at him and try to make him understand that the dog's just hungry like all of them, but it'd be a miracle if anyone could reason with Brett. Coldly, Stan looks at him and asks Brett to not kick the dog. Goes back to reading the captain's journal. Brett continues to defend his actions by stating that the food is his and his alone. This begins an argument between him, Kelly, and Thomas. Stan's dog sees this as an opportunity and tries to lunge at the food, but Brett kicks him in the side again, harder this time. The dog yelps as he's pushed to the side when Stan puts his book down and tells Brett more sternly to not kick the dog again. Brett has had it with Stan, and he simply holds up his middle finger as he continues to hungrily chow down his food. The next second, bang! A bullet hits Brett straight in the chest, and it's Stan who shot him without flinching a bit or without even an ounce of remorse in his eyes. Nobody reacts except Kelly as Thomas tries to calm her down. Kittrick sits in the distance, knowing too well that this was a long time coming, while for the first time in weeks, Cindy looks at Stan, who dejectedly slumps his shoulders and starts walking away from the group, just like her. They now had Brett's supplies, and they traveled for 2 more days without saying a word. No one in the group now, not even Kelly or Thomas, tried to make small talk. And it was after these 2 days Stan finally approached Cindy with a heavy heart. She didn't say anything to him this time. No death stare, as Stan goes on to tell her that she should go back and bury Patrick. This is when her death stare returned, but Stan too was at the brink of his being. Without a care, he goes on to tell her that she needs this closure, that she needs it for herself. He promises to come along with her and implores her to see that she needs this, that she needs to accept that she did what she had to. Cindy didn't have a choice. He promises that he doesn't have an ulterior motive, that he's just trying his hardest to be the good guy after doing horrific things, just like the captain. And then he shows Cindy the journal he found. They talk about the kids they murdered, how Cindy didn't have to stop to help them back when she did, how she needed to get some closure to preserve that piece of good in her. There's a long pause, and when Cindy finally speaks up, she asks Stan for some time to go over what he's just said. Stan knows he's hit the mark, and that Cindy will agree with him. He leaves her alone without a second word. The next day, Stan hands over a list of 5 locations the rest of the group will be crossing through over the next few weeks. He asks them to wait for them at each location, as Cindy and he will surely catch up with them at one of them. Thomas doesn't protest. In fact, he tells Stan he's doing the right thing. They all owe their lives to Cindy, and this is the least they can do for her. Stan shakes everybody's hands as he parts ways. He reminisces how he would have loved to be at the diner with these people, these friends, but that is a dream for another lifetime. Him, his dog, and Cindy now part ways from the rest of the crew. Crossed issue number 9, Goodbye Patrick, Hello Alaska. Well, we're at the last issue of Crossed, guys, and if you're stuck with us so far, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. If you've liked the video, please show us some love by dropping a like and subscribe, or if you've not liked something, be sure to tell us in the comments below. So, without further ado, let's get into the final issue. Stan and Cindy have now walked for miles and have reached the desert once again. In reversal of roles, Stan is the one leading them, and he puts his hand up for Cindy to stop when he sees Patrick's body. He walks down to the shore where he and the rest of Horsecock's crew was shot up and wraps Patrick up in a blanket so that Cindy doesn't have to see his mangled body. Once he's wrapped from head to toe, he hands him over to Cindy and in a timid voice mentions the ridge to be a decent place for Patrick's grave. Cindy winces and holds back tears as she simply agrees with him and takes a hold of her son's body. Stan turns around and keeps an eye out for any signs of danger while Cindy says her last goodbyes to Patrick and buries him in the background. Once she's done, the dam of tears she'd created since Patrick's death finally breaks loose, and she weeps relentlessly. Stan doesn't dare approach, and he lets her have her moment. Maybe it was a few minutes, or maybe it was a few hours. Stan doesn't remember, but once Cindy's done, she approaches Stan from behind and says, "There is nothing special about me." Cindy's talking about the time Stan called her special for saving his life, for saving their lives multiple times, for always being an excellent mother to Patrick, for always being the best survivalist Stan had ever seen. And right now, the way Cindy looked, anyone would have believed her, but not Stan. Bruises, dirty clothes, torn pants, unkempt hair, and yet the look in Stan's eyes told her he didn't believe her one bit. Cindy then opens up to Stan as she cleans herself up in the river. She tells him that her grandfather taught her how to use guns because he believed that women should know how to protect themselves, and that she married a bastard because she was stupid and naive. Her husband beat her till she could take no more and had to stand up for herself. This was a mistake because since then she'd been running from town to Patrick. Her situation forced her to learn discipline. Learn that she could never let go or get too comfortable, that this is all there was to her. This isn't special. Stan doesn't say anything, and once she's done cleaning up, they set out to catch up with their crew at breakneck speed. At night, they decide to rest in an abandoned church at the edge of a town. Stan looks up at the statue of Jesus Christ in horror as he sees a decomposing body hanging from it in the same position as Christ. Once he's done, they both have food as Stan asks her how she feels. Cindy doesn't know how she feels, but thanks Stan for forcing her to do the right thing. It's the least Stan could do, as Cindy opens up further. She's got a burning feeling inside her that tells her that all she did was for nothing. All the care, all the things she did to keep Patrick safe had all gone down the drain, that it was all a waste of time. She then remembers the time they both murdered the children, how she'd felt it was the right thing to do, how she didn't want them around Patrick. Now that they'd done that, now that they'd become child murderers, where did that leave them? What did that make them? Stan takes a long pause and then reminds her that all they did was for survival. Theirs and the people they're traveling with. Sure, some of them died making their actions null and void, but it wasn't all for waste. It was just for survival. The two of them sit in silence as Cindy soaks in their conversation. She then turns her gaze toward the hanging body on Christ's statue and suggests that they should remove it before they leave. Stan agrees, and the two of them sit there eating their food in silence. On the other side of the country, Thomas and Kelly travel in front while Kittrick drags himself behind them. They've been through 2 agreed locations where they were supposed to meet Cindy and Stan with no sign of them. Kelly still has hopes for the 3rd location, but Thomas is on the edge. He isn't too comfortable making decisions for the group, at least not like Cindy and Stan. The two of them talk for a while when Kittrick tells them that they're being followed by Horsecock's crew, and it's too late. Thomas tries to turn around in shock, but Kittrick asks them to carry on as though they haven't noticed. It's their only advantage. Kittrick managed to spot a few of them trying to circle around them, which is why he's sure it's Horsecock's crew. If it was anyone else, they would have been ambushed the moment they were spotted. Kittrick then asks the two of them to leave him behind, but to not run until the shooting starts. Kittrick plans to draw them in and kill as many of them as possible. Kelly and Thomas try to protest, but Kittrick tells them he's itching to die, itching to meet his wife and children up in heaven. He then doesn't wait for them to protest again. He simply turns around and starts walking in the opposite direction. Kittrick then falls to his knees and pretends to be dejected, as though the group has abandoned him. But behind his back, he holds his pistol and remembers his family as he waits for the cross to attack. Soon enough, Horsecock's crew comes out of the trees brandishing weapons and eager to kill off Kittrick. But as they approach, Stump lets out a huge cry. He seems to have spotted a scent or has heard something. This stops Horsecock and his crew dead in their tracks, and they decide to attack Kittrick from a distance. They all start shooting him from a distance, and Kittrick curses and retaliates back at them. He manages to get a few of them, but there are too many of them, and too many of them are armed with automatic rifles. Cindy and Stan seem to be nearby as they can hear the gunfire from a distance. Turns out it was their scent Stump had caught onto. They quickly rush to find where the shooting is coming from, suspecting that it's Thomas and the rest of the group. Meanwhile, Kittrick is riddled with dozens of bullets and is lying on the ground, but refusing to give up. He continues shooting when he's confronted by Face, the crossed old man who carries Stump on his back. Kittrick lifts his arm to shoot him, but Face slices his arm off with a swipe of his machete. Face then tries to rape Kittrick, but is soon smacked away by Horsecock, who's ordered his crew to kill only. Face is furious. He wants his share of fun, but Horsecock tells him there's no time for that. They need to go after the others, and when Face screams at him in fury, Horsecock hits him again and again and again. The leader of the crew keeps hitting Face until Face's face is nothing but pulp. He then picks up Stump and puts him on his own back as he orders the rest to go after the others. Thomas and Kelly are frantically running as they desperately try to push Kittrick's fate out of their minds. Cindy and Stan, too, are rushing through the forest, desperately trying to locate their friends. Thomas continues to lead Kelly desperately through the woods, trying to get some distance between him and Horsecock's crew when they soon hear movement around them. They quickly hide, and a cross soon comes out of the woods nearby, searching for any signs of them. They hide behind a fallen tree and wait for the searching cross to move out. They wait for an hour, like the group usually did in such scenarios before leaving. They're now walking alongside a cliff as Thomas tries to paint a picture for Kelly in case something happens to him. He tells Kelly that the cliff is 10 yards from the tree line to their right, and she should remember this at all costs. The two of them plan their next move, finding little to no way to leave the forest and reach the third agreed-upon location without getting caught by Horsecock's crew. Unbeknownst to them, Stan and Cindy are rushing through the same forest, desperately looking for any signs of their friends. But then, the worst they could imagine happens. Horsecock ambushes them by jumping out of the tree line in front of them and hits Thomas right across the face with his, favorite weapon. Thomas loses his gun when he gets smacked, as well as his glasses. There's more Cross looking at what Horsecock does to Kelly from the woods, while Thomas desperately looks around for his glasses. Horsecock toys and tortures Kelly, but then suddenly Thomas leaps at him and bites a huge chunk of flesh out of Horsecock's neck. His crew watches on in shock and horror as their leader bleeds to death, while the weight of his being crushes Stump underneath him. Kelly manages to find Thomas's gun on the ground while Thomas coughs his own and Horsecock's blood out of his lungs. Stump starts to squirm and scream underneath Horsecock, and this gives Kelly a good idea about where they are. Soon, Thomas joins her, holds the gun in her hands, and shoots both Stump and Horsecock directly in the head. Once he's done, he orders Kelly to run, but the poor girl is in tears. She loves Thomas, and he's done so much for her. She doesn't want to leave him, but Thomas knows that he could turn any moment and Kelly needs to run. Thomas looks into the woods and sees the other members of the dead Horsecock's crew approaching them. He knows it's already too late for him and Kelly, so he decides to uphold his promise to her. Both of them shed tears and say their last goodbyes before jumping off of the cliff near them. Stan and Cindy had managed to find them, but they were on the other side of the valley. They saw all of this unfold through their binoculars, and both are now on the verge of tears. Stan sits on a nearby rock, caressing his rock, as Cindy and him plan their next move. They plan to wait a day for the cross to leave the area. If they don't, then they'll circle around them tomorrow. But Cindy has different plans. She wants to eradicate each member of Horsecock's crew, because if they are indeed evolved crust, she doesn't want any of them escaping. Their chances are good too. They're all gathered in a single location, and if there were more of them around, they would have shown up to this location by now. Stan is apprehensive, but Cindy tells him that Stump's dead too. This is the best advantageous scenario they could have ever dreamed of, and so Stan agrees. They stalk the group until the next day and decide to ambush them in an open field where they can see everything for miles around them. Cindy sees someone trying to organize the crew, and she wants to take him out first. She puts down her binoculars with renewed vigor and determination. Stan and Cindy start firing at what remains of Horsecock's crew. The one trying to organize the crew gets shot through his heart first, then it's time for the rest of them. One by one, with extreme precision, Stan and Cindy take out the entire crew. Even though their sheer numbers give them a chance to charge at them, they all get shot down before they can cover more than a few feet. Cindy stands up in defiance as she shoots down the very last of them. It's all over, and the sudden silence, the wind blowing through the tall grass, the hills in the distance, make for a rather peaceful view. The one who was trying to organize the crew is still sort of alive and screaming,
Beautiful! It was gonna be beautiful.
But before he can say more, Stan shoots him directly in the head without any remorse. Stan and Cindy traveled for a few days more without speaking much to each other before they finally reached the edge of the northern wilderness of Alaska. The cold barrier seemed like a nice border from the world they'd left behind, and the fact that they didn't encounter any crust along the way is another good sign for where they're headed. Stan looks on with determination and anticipation of the future, as though he's planning for what's to come, and yet, internally, he's reviewing the horrific acts he's done to get to this point, and whether it was worth it. Yet, his face shows the same determination we've seen on Cindy's face all this while throughout the story, and for the first time, Cindy is looking at Stan the way he's looked at her all this while. Stan fails to notice her look and starts walking downhill toward the white mountains that await them, and as their figures grow smaller and smaller in the distance, we see Cindy reach out and hold Stan's hand. The last page of the last comic ends with a beautiful and serene panel of Cindy and Stan walking into the sunset while holding each other's hand.